Good afternoon. I am Trillian Atwood, the Director of Public Programs and Visitor Experience at the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presentation this afternoon, An Afternoon of Asimov. Before we go any further, I'd like to thank our partners in this presentation, the Enoch Pratt Free Library, and especially Tracy Diamond, Adult Services Coordinator with the library, who you'll be seeing a little more of later. I'd also like to open by thanking all of the individuals you'll be hearing read this afternoon. We very much appreciate them joining us for this event. Some of you will notice that our readers today have the letter R before their names. Don't worry, we've not taken a leap into Asimov's imagined future populated by robots, all of whom have that letter R at the start of their name. Rather, it's done just to make tech a bit easier. Now, finally, just to confirm, the afternoon's divided into 3 parts. So first off, there's our community reading of the last question. Then we have a presentation with our speaker today, Alec Navala-Lee. And finally, we wrap up the afternoon with another community reading of Nightfall. For those of you that would like to read along with us in the reading, we're going to drop into chat another link that'll give you the full text of both of the pieces that we're going to be reading this afternoon. I do also want to take a moment to note that in our meetings to prep for this program, we were really fortunate to hear some fantastic stories from some of our readers about why Isaac Asimov was so important to them. As such, keep an eye on chat, and we'll be sharing some short pieces from our storytellers about their connections with Asimov. That'll happen as they're reading their sections. So the presentation today is at least partly inspired by the current JMM exhibit, Jews in Space, Members of the Tribe in Orbit. From ancient astronomers to today's space scientists and astronauts, Jewish people have been interested in looking up. Outer space has also inspired Jewish artists, writers, comedians, and thinkers to boldly imagine realms beyond our Earth. Visit our website using the link also in chat for more information about our virtual offerings, including our virtual exhibit, tours, and upcoming programs. Now, it's understood that 2020 would probably have marked Asimov's 100th birthday. And so, though a little late, admittedly, thanks to COVID, it seemed fitting that we had to honor him in some way in connection with this exhibit. A lecture didn't feel enough, and so we wanted to build in this community reading element of 2 pieces of his work. Now I'm going to leave it to Mr. Navala-Lee, who can really get into the importance of the last question, but I will note for you guys that it was first published in 1956 in the Science Fiction Quarterly, and then it's appeared in several anthologies of Asimov's work in the following years. But that doesn't actually explain why we're opening with this piece, and so instead of me explaining it to you, I thought I would just read the preface that Asimov himself wrote for the last question. So here we are. This is by far my favorite story of all those I have written. After all, I undertook to tell several trillion years of human history in the space of a short story, and I leave it to you as to how well I succeeded. I also undertook another task, but I won't tell you what that was, lest I spoil the story for you. It is a curious fact that the innumerable readers have asked me if I wrote this story. They seem never to remember the title of the story or for sure the author, except for the vague thought that it might be me. But of course, they never forget the story itself, especially the ending. The idea seems to drown out everything, and I am satisfied that it should. And so, with that, let's begin our reading of the last question. Michael, can you please take us away?
Last question was asked for the first time, half in jest, on May 21st, 2061. At a time when humanity first stepped into the light, the question came about as a result of a $5 bet over highballs, and it happened this way. Alexander Adel and Bertram Lupov were 2 of the faithful attendants of Multivac. As well as any human beings could, they knew what lay behind the cold, clicking, flashing face. Miles and miles of face of that giant computer. They had at least a vague notion of the general plan of relays and circuits that had long since grown past the point where any single human could possibly have a firm grasp of the whole. Multivac was self-adjusting and self-correcting. It had to be, for nothing human could adjust and correct it quickly enough or even adequately enough. So Adele and Lupov attended the monstrous giant only lightly and superficially, yet as well as any men could. They fed it data, adjusted questions to its needs, and translated the answers that were issued. Certainly they, and all others like them, were fully entitled to share in the glory that was Multivacs. For decades, Multivac had helped design the ships and plot the trajectories that enabled man to reach the moon, Mars, and Venus. But past that, Earth's poor resources could not support the ships. Too much energy was needed for the long trips. Earth exploited its coal and uranium with increasing efficiency, but there was only so much of both. But slowly, Multivac learned enough to answer deeper questions more fundamentally. And on May 14th, 2061, what had been theory became fact. The energy of the sun was stored, converted, and utilized directly on a planet-wide scale. All Earth turned off its burning coal, its fissioning uranium, and flipped the switch that connected all of it to a small station 1 mile in diameter, and flipped the switch that connected all of it to a small station circling Earth at half the distance of the moon. All Earth ran by invisible beams of sun power. 7 days had not sufficed to dim the glory of it, and Adele and Lupov finally managed to escape from the public functions and to meet in quiet where no one would think of looking for them, in the deserted underground chambers where portions of the mighty buried body of Multivac showed. Unattended, idling, sorting data with contented, lazy clickings, Multivac 2 had earned its vacation, and the boys appreciated that. They had no intention originally of disturbing it. They had brought a bottle with them, and their only concern at the moment was to relax in the company of each other and the bottle. "It's amazing when you think of it," said Adele. His broad face had lines of weariness in it, and he stirred his drink slowly with a glass rod, watching the cubes of ice slur clumsily about. "All the energy we can possibly ever use for free. Enough energy, if we wanted to draw on it, to melt all Earth into a big drop of impure liquid iron, and still never miss the energy so used. All the energy we could ever use forever and forever and forever." Lupov cocked his head sideways. He had a trick of doing that when he wanted to be contrary, and he wanted to be contrary now, partly because he had had to carry the ice and glassware. "Not forever," he said. "Oh, hell, just about forever, till the sun runs out, Bert." "That's not forever." "All right, then. Billions and billions of years. 10 billion, maybe. Are you satisfied?" Lupov put his fingers through his thinning hair as though to reassure himself that some was still left, and sipped gently at his own drink. 10 billion years isn't forever." "Well, it will last our time, won't it?" "So would the coal and uranium." "All right, but now we can hook up each individual spaceship to the solar station, and it can go to Pluto and back 1 million times without ever worrying about fuel. You can't do that on coal and uranium. Ask Multivac if you don't believe me." "I don't have to ask Multivac. I know that." "Then stop running down what Multivac's done for us," said Adele, blazing up. "It did all right." "Who says it didn't? What I say is that a sun won't last forever. That's all I'm saying. We're safe for 10 billion years. But then what? Lupov pointed a slightly shaky finger at the other. And don't say we'll switch to another sun. There was silence for a while. Adele put his glass to his lips only occasionally, and Lupov's eyes slowly closed. They rested. Then Lupov's eyes snapped open. You're thinking we'll switch to another sun when ours is done, aren't you? I'm not thinking. Sure you are. You're weak on logic. That's the trouble with you. You're like the guy in the story who was caught in a sudden shower and who ran to a grove of trees and got under one. He wasn't worried, you see, because he figured when one tree got wet through, he would just get under another one. I get it, said Adele. Don't shout. When the sun is done, the other stars will be gone too. Darn right they will, muttered Lupov. It all had a beginning in the original cosmic explosion, whatever that was, and it'll all have an end when all the stars run down. Some run down faster than others. Hell, the giants won't last 100 million years. The sun will last 10 billion years, and maybe the dwarfs will last 200 billion for all the good they are. But just give us 1,000,000,000,000 years and everything will be dark. Entropy has to increase to maximum, that's all. I know all about entropy, said Adele, standing on his dignity. The hell you do. I know as much as you. Then you know everything's got to run down someday. All right, who says they won't? You did, you poor sap. You said we had all the energy we needed forever. You said forever. It was Adele's turn to be contrary. Maybe we can build things up again someday, he said. Never. Why not? Someday. Never. Ask Multivac. You ask Multivac. I dare you. $5 says it can't be done. Adele was just drunk enough to try, just sober enough to be able to phrase the necessary symbols and operations into a question which, in words, might have corresponded to this. Will mankind one day, without the net expenditure of energy, be able to restore the sun to its full youthfulness, even after it had died of old age? Or maybe it could be put more simply, like this. How can the net amount of entropy of the universe be massively decreased? Multivac fell dead and silent. The slow flashing of lights ceased. The distant sounds of clicking relays ended. Then, just as the frightened technicians felt they could hold their breath no longer, there was a sudden springing to life of the teletype attached to that portion of Multivac. 5 words were printed. Insufficient data for meaningful answer. No bet, whispered Lupov. They left hurriedly. By next morning, the two, plagued with throbbing head and cottony mouth, had forgotten the incident.
Jared, Jaredine, and Jaredette 1 and 2 watched the starry picture in the visiplate, changed as the passage through hyperspace was completed in its non-time lapse. At once, the even powdering of stars gave way to the predominance of a single bright shining disk, the size of a marble, centered on the viewing screen. That's X-23, said Jared confidently. His thin hands clamped tightly behind his back, and the knuckles whitened. The little Jaredettes, 2 girls, had experienced the hyperspace passage for the first time in their lives and were self-conscious over the momentary sensation of inside outness. They buried their giggles and chased one another wildly about their mother, screaming, "We've reached X23! We've reached X23! We—" "Quiet, children," said Geraldine sharply. "Are you sure, Jared?" "What is there to be but sure?" asked Jared, glancing up at the bulge of featureless metal just under the ceiling. It ran the length of the room, disappearing through the wall at either end. It was as long as the ship. Jared scarcely knew a thing about the thick rod of metal, except that it was called a microvac, that one asked its questions if one wished, that if one did not, it still had its task of guiding the ship to a preordained destination, of feeding on energies from the various subgalactic power stations, of computing the equations for the hyperspatial jumps. Jared and his family had only to wait and live in the comfortable residence quarters of the ship. Someone had once told Jared that the AC at the end of microvac stood for automatic computer in ancient English, but he was on the edge of forgetting even that. Geraldine's eyes were moist as she watched the visiplate. "I can't help it. I feel funny about leaving Earth." "Why, for Pete's sake?" demanded Jared. "We had nothing there. We'll have everything on X23. You won't be alone. You won't be a pioneer. There are over 1 million people on the planet already. Good Lord, our great-grandchildren will be looking for new worlds because X23 will be overcrowded." Then, after a reflective pause, "I tell you, it's a lucky thing the computers worked out interstellar travel the way the race is growing." I know," said Geraldine miserably. Geraldette One said promptly, "Our microvac is the best microvac in the world." "I think so too," said Jared, tousling her hair. It was a nice feeling to have a microvac of your own, and Jared was glad he was part of his generation and no other. In his father's youth, the only computers had been tremendous machines taking up 100 square miles of land. There was only one to a planet. Planetary ACs, they were called. They had been growing in size steadily for 1,000 years, and then all at once came refinement. In place of transistors had come molecular valves, so that even the largest planetary AC could be put into a space only half the volume of a spaceship. Jared felt uplifted, as he always did, when he thought that his own personal microvac was many times more complicated than the ancient and primitive multivac that had first tamed the sun, and almost as complicated as Earth's planetary AC, the largest, that had first solved the problem of hyperspatial travel and had made trips to the stars possible. "So many stars, so many planets," sighed Geraldine, busy with her own thoughts. "I suppose families will be going out to new planets forever, the way we are now." "Not forever," said Jared with a smile. "It will all stop someday. but not for billions of years, many billions. Even the stars run down, you know. Entropy must increase. What's entropy, Daddy? Shrilled Geraldette too. Entropy, little sweet, is just a word which means the amount of running down of the universe. Everything runs down, you know, like your little walkie-talkie robot, remember? Can't you just put in a new power unit like with my robot? The stars are the power units, dear. Once they're gone, there are no more power units. Geraldette at once set up a howl. Don't let them, Daddy. Don't let the stars run down. Now look what you've done, whispered Geraldine, exasperated. How was I to know it would frighten them? Jared whispered back. Ask the microvac, wailed Geraldette one. Ask him how to turn the stars on again. Go ahead, said Geraldine. It will quiet them down. Geraldette, too, was crying, too. Jared shrugged. Now, honeys. I'll ask Microvac. Don't worry, he'll tell us. He asked the Microvac, adding quickly, print the answer. Jared cupped the strip of thin cellufilm and said cheerfully, See now, the Microvac says it will take care of everything when the time comes, so don't worry. Geraldine said, And now, children, it's time for bed. We'll be in our new home soon. Jared read the words on the cellufilm again before destroying it. It read, Insufficient data for meaningful answer. He shrugged and looked at the visiplate. X-23 was just ahead.
VJ-23X of Lammoth stared into the black depths of the three-dimensional small-scale maps of the galaxy and said, Are we ridiculous? I wonder in being so concerned about the matter. MQ-17J of Nikron shook his head. I think not. You know the galaxy will be filled in 5 years at the present rate of expansion. Both seemed in their early 20s. Both were tall and perfectly formed. Still, said VJ-23X, I hesitate to submit a pessimistic report to the Galactic Council. I wouldn't consider any other kind of report. Stir them up a bit. We've got to stir them up. VJ-23X sighed. Space is infinite. 100 billion galaxies are there for the taking. More. 100 billion is not infinite, and it's getting less infinite all the time. Consider, 20,000 years ago, mankind first solved the problem of utilizing stellar energy, and a few centuries later, interstellar travel became possible. It took mankind 1 million years to fill one small world, and then only 15,000 years to fill the rest of the galaxy. Now the population doubles every 10 years. VJ-23X interrupted. We can thank immortality for that. Very well, immortality exists, and we have to take it into account. I admit it has its seamy side, this immortality. The galactic AC has solved many problems for us, but in solving the problem of preventing old age and death, it has undone all its other solutions. Yet you wouldn't want to abandon life, I suppose. Not at all, snapped MQ-17J, softening all at once into, not yet. I'm by no means old enough. How old are you? 223. And you? I'm still under 200. But to get back to my point, population doubles every 10 years. Once this galaxy is filled, we'll have filled another in 10 years, and another in 10 years, and we will have filled 2 more. Another decade, 4. In 100 years, we will have filled 1,000 galaxies. In 1,000 years, 1,000,000 galaxies. In 10,000 years, the entire known universe. Then what? VJ23X said, as a side issue, there's a problem of transportation. I wonder how many sun power units it will take to move galaxies of individuals from one galaxy to the next. A very good point. Already mankind consumes 2 sun power units per year. Most of it's wasted. After all, our own galaxy alone pours out 1,000 sun power units a year, and we only use 2 of those. Granted, but even with 100% efficiency, we only stave off the end. Our energy requirements are going up in geometric progression even faster than our population. We'll run out of energy even sooner than we run out of galaxies. A good point, a very good point. Well, we'll just have to build new stars out of interstellar gas or out of dissipated heat. MQ117J said sarcastically. There may be some way to reverse entropy. We ought to ask the galactic AC. VJ23X was not really serious, but MQ17J pulled out his AC contact from his pocket and placed it on the table before him. I have half a mind to, he said. It's something the human race will have to face someday. He stared somberly at his small AC contact. It was only 2 inches cubed and nothing in itself, but it was connected through hyperspace with the great galactic AC that served all mankind. Hyperspace considered, it was an integral part of the galactic AC. MQ17 paused to wonder if someday in his immortal life he would get to see the galactic AC. It was only a little world of its own, a spider webbing of force beams holding the matter within which surges, submasons took the place of old clumsy molecular valves. Yet despite his subetheric workings, the galactic AC was known to be a full 1,000 feet across. MQ17 asked suddenly of his AC contact, can entropy be reversed? VJ23X looked startled and said at once, oh, say, I didn't really mean to have to ask you that. Why not? We both know entropy can't be reversed. You can't turn smoke and ash back into a tree. Do you have trees on our world? Asked MQ17J. The sound of the galactic AC startled them into silence. The voice came thin and beautiful out of a small AC contact on the desk. It said, there is insufficient data for a meaningful answer. VJ23X said, see? The 2 men thereupon returned the question of the report they were to make to the Galactic Council.
Z Prime's mind spanned the new galaxy with a faint interest in the countless twists of stars that powered it. It had never seen this one before. Would he ever see them all? So many of them, each with its load of humanity, but a load that was almost a dead weight. More and more, the real essence of man was to be found out there in space. Minds, not bodies. The immortal bodies remained behind on the planets, in suspension over eons. Sometimes they roused for material activity, but that was growing rarer. Fewer individuals were coming into existence to join the incredibly mighty throng, but what matter? There was little room in the universe for new individuals. Z Prime was roused out of his reverie upon coming across a wispy tendril of another mind. I am Z Prime, said Z Prime. And you? I am D sub 1. Your galaxy? We call it the galaxy. And you? We call ours the same. All men call their galaxy and nothing more. Why not? True, since all galaxies are the same. Not all galaxies, but on one particular galaxy, the race of man must have originated. That makes it different. Z Prime asked, on which one? I cannot say. The universal AC would know. Shall we ask him? I'm suddenly curious. Z Prime's perceptions broadened until the galaxies themselves shrank and became a new, more diffuse powering on a much larger background. So many hundreds of billions of them, all with their immortal beings, all carrying their load of intelligences with minds that drifted freely through space. And yet one of them was unique among them all in being the original galaxy. One of them had, in its vague and distant past, a period when it was the only galaxy populated by man. Z Prime was consumed with curiosity to see this galaxy, and he called out, Universal AC! On which galaxy did mankind originate? The Universal AC heard, for on every world and throughout space, it had its receptors ready. Each receptor led through hyperspace to some unknown point where the Universal AC kept itself aloof. Z Prime knew of only one man whose thoughts had penetrated within sensing distance of the Universal AC. He reported only a shining globe 2 feet across, difficult to see. But how can that be all of the Universal AC? Z Prime had asked. Most of it had been, the answer is in hyperspace. In what form it is, there I cannot imagine, nor could anyone, for the day had long since passed, Z Prime knew, when any man had any part of the makings of a Universal AC. Each Universal AC designed and constructed its successor. Each during its existence of 1 million years or more accumulated the necessary data to build a better and more intricate, more capable successor in which its store of data and individuality would be submerged. The Universal AC interrupted Z Prime's wandering thoughts, not with words, but with guidance. Z Prime's mentality was guided into the dim star sea of galaxies, and in one particular enlarged into stars. The thought came infinitely distant, but infinitely clear. This is the original galaxy of man. But was the same after all, the same as any other, and Z Prime stifled his disappointment. D sub 1, whose mind had accompanied the other, said suddenly, and is one of these stars the original star of man? The Universal AC said, man's original star has gone nova. It is a white dwarf. Did the men die upon it? Asked Z Prime, startled and without thinking. The Universal AC said, a new world, as in such cases are constructed for their physical bodies in time. Yes, of course, said Z Prime, but a sense of loss overwhelmed him even more. His mind released its hold on the original galaxy of man, letting it spring back and lose itself among the blurred pinpoints. He never wanted to see it again. D sub 1 said, what is wrong? The stars are dying. The original star is dead. They must all die. Why not? But when all energy is gone, our bodies will finally die, and you and I with them. It'll take billions of years. I do not wish it to happen even after billions of years. Universal AC, how may stars be kept from dying? D sub 1 said in amusement, you've asked how entropy might be reversed in direction. And the Universal AC answered, there is as yet insufficient data for a meaningful answer. Z Prime's thoughts fled back to his own galaxy. He gave no further thought to D sub 1, whose body might be waiting in a galaxy a trillion light years away or on the star next to Z Prime's own. It didn't matter. Unhappily, Z Prime began collecting interstellar hydrogen out of which to build a small star of his own. If the stars must someday die, at least some could yet be built.
Man considered with himself, for in a way, man, mentally, was one. He consisted of a trillion ageless bodies, each in its place, each resting quiet and incorruptible, each cared for by perfect automatons, equally incorruptible, while the minds of all the bodies freely melted at one into the other, indistinguishable. Man said, "The universe is dying." Man looked about at the dimming galaxies. The giant stars, spendthrifts, were gone long ago, back in the dimmest of the dim far past. Almost all stars were white dwarfs, fading to the end. New stars had been built of the dust between the stars, some by natural processes, some by man himself. And those were going too. White dwarfs might yet be crashed together, and of the mighty forces so released, new stars built, but only one star for every 1,000 white dwarfs destroyed, and those would come to an end too. Man said, carefully husbanded, as directed by the cosmic AC, the energy that is even yet left in all the universe will last for billions of years. But even so, said man, eventually it will all come to an end. However it may be husbanded, however stretched out, the energy once expended is gone and cannot be restored. Entropy must increase forever to the maximum. Man said, can entropy not be reversed? Let us ask the cosmic AC. The cosmic AC surrounded them, but not in space. Not a fragment of it was in space. It was in hyperspace, made of something that was neither matter nor energy. The question of its size and nature no longer had any meaning in any terms that man could comprehend. Cosmic AC, said man, how may entropy be reversed? The cosmic AC said, there is as yet insufficient data for a meaningful answer. Man said, collect additional data. The cosmic AC said, I will do so. I have been doing so for 100 billion years. My predecessors and I have been asked this question many times. All the data I have remains insufficient. Will there come a time, said man, when data will be sufficient, or is the problem insoluble in all conceivable circumstances? The cosmic AC said, no problem is insoluble in all conceivable circumstances. Man said, when will you have enough data to answer the question? The cosmic AC said, there is as yet insufficient data for a meaningful answer. Will you keep working on it? Asked man. The cosmic AC said, I will. Man said, we shall wait.
The stars and galaxies died and snuffed out, and space grew black after 10 trillion years of running down. One by one, man fused with AC, each physical body losing its mental identity in a manner that was somehow not a loss, but a gain. Man's last mind paused before fusion, looking over a space that included nothing but the dregs of one last dark star and nothing besides incredibly thin matter, agitated randomly by the tag ends of heat wearing out asymptotically to the absolute zero. Man said, AC, is this the end? Can this chaos not be reversed into the universe once more? Can that not be done? AC said, there is as yet insufficient data for a meaningful answer. man's last mind fused and only AC existed, and that in hyperspace.
Matter and energy had ended, and with it, time, space, and time. Even AC existed only for the sake of the one last question that it had never answered. From the time a half-drunken computer technician 10 trillion years before had asked the question of a computer that was to AC far less than was a man to man. All other questions had been answered, and until this last question was answered also, AC might not release his consciousness. All collected data had come to a final end. Nothing was left to be collected. But all collected data had yet to be completely correlated and put together in all possible relationships. A timeless interval was spent in doing that. And it came to pass that AC learned how to reverse the direction of entropy. But there was now no man to whom AC might give the answer of the last question. No matter, the answer by demonstration would take care of that too. For another timeless interval, AC thought how best to do this. Carefully, AC organized the program. The consciousness of AC encompassed all of what had once been a universe and brooded over what was now chaos. Step by step, it must be done. And AC said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
Wow, thank you so much to all of our readers. Please give them virtual applause in the chat, in Zoom, and on Facebook. So thank you again, Michael, Martha, Tracy, Miriam, Dave K, Michael, and Arthur. I'm looking forward to Nightfall later. And before we get started with Alec's presentation, I wanted to say hello to all of you that have joined us on Zoom and on Facebook. I'm Tracy Diamond, the Adult Services Coordinator at the Pratt Library. And a couple things about the library. During the pandemic, we are here for you with access to sidewalk service, mobile printing, drive-in Wi-Fi, mobile hotspots and tablets, virtual events like this one, and digital materials. So I do encourage you to visit prattlibrary.org to learn more. And today we are so thrilled to be partnered with the Jewish Museum of Maryland and to have been working closely with Trillian Atwood and Laura Grant for today's virtual event about Isaac Asimov. And it's my pleasure to be here to introduce Alec Navala Lee to help us better understand Asimov and his works. Alec Navala Lee was a 2019 Hugo and Locus Award finalist for the group biography, Astounding, John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, L. Ron Hubbard, and the Golden Age of Science Fiction, which was named one of the best nonfiction books of the year by The Economist. He is the author of 3 novels from Penguin, including The Icon Thief, and a frequent contributor to such publications as The New York Times and Analog Science Fiction and Fact. Syndromes, an audio original collection of his short stories from Analog, was recently released by Recorded Books. His biography of the architectural designer Buckminster Fuller will be published by HarperCollins in 2021. So Alec, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was great. And before we dive into your presentation, could you offer some commentary on the last question for us?
Yeah, I would love to. So I'm really pleased by the event so far, because I actually requested the story. When I was approached to speak here today, I was asked, are there any Asimov stories that you think would make a good choice for this kind of the online reading? And the first story that I thought of was The Last Question, for a few reasons. So number one, I love it. It's my favorite Asimov story. Number two is that it's actually had great success in the past as a story for audio presentation for public readings, because starting in the early 70s, there was a whole series of planetariums that would present The Last Question as a live or recorded reading for audiences. And there was a famous version with Leonard Nimoy, that ran for a long time. And Asimov says that he was actually approached to do the narration for one version. And he said that, I have this thick Brooklyn accent. I think it's going to, sound strange to people. And they said, no, it's fine. You should just go ahead and record it. And he did. And then when he went there to the premiere, he found they'd replaced him with sort of like a generic Middle American narrator instead. So he said that, he earned more money from The Last Question's planetarium readings than it ever earned for him in print. And the answer is obvious. You can see why. It works, wonderfully in this kind of format. And I thought, it sounded great today. So it's a story that clearly is made for this kind of presentation, in large part because of the ending, which I think is fantastic. And Asimov agreed. He thought that was the best story that he ever wrote. And he knew this almost right away. Like I will eventually tell a bit more about the background behind how the story came to be written. But for now, I just want to quickly read a line from Asimov's diary. So he wrote the story in 2 sittings, without really changing anything, and finished it on June 4th, 1956. And he said that in his diary that night, he wrote that it was, quote, the computer story to end all computer stories, or who knows, the science fiction story to end all science fiction stories. So on the day he wrote it, he knew that he had something special. And readers responded. As we heard earlier, Asimov would often hear from people saying, there's a story that I can remember. I'm not sure if it was you. I think maybe it was. And they could never quite place anything about the story except the last sentence. And it was always the last question. And, there are times when, he would get a call from a reader and the reader would say, oh, so this is a story that I think maybe you wrote. And he would say right away, the last question. And they were always amazed that, they knew what story, that he knew what story they were asking about. So it clearly made a huge impact. And I think, it's still very powerful. There are aspects of it that might seem a little bit dated. The way that it talks about computing, obviously reflects the state of the art of the mid 50s and not, where we stand now. But, one thing that struck me listening to it just today is that it's a very early example of what science fiction writers now call a singularity story. So the idea of the singularity is that, given the accelerating curve of technological development, eventually we're going to hit this runaway point where we'll have algorithms or computers that can essentially write better versions of themselves. And so we'll start this runaway cycle of improvement that will quickly leave behind human intelligence, and result in what some expect to be almost a godlike AI. And this is implicit in Asimov's story. He says at one point that, each universal AC designs its successor. And this is the central premise of the singularity, which has in recent years escaped the science fiction category and become an issue that is being debated right now, by researchers in artificial intelligence, by people who are, concerned about transhumanism and sort of what the future holds when it comes to artificial intelligence. So in this story, as in a lot of other stories, Asimov, was able to codify and anticipate ideas that later, have become very relevant to the way we think about, these issues today. Are there any questions, before we move on to other subjects about this particular story?
Yes, I am looking through the chat. If anyone has a specific question about The Last Question, I will read that out. Right now, lots of people sharing their experiences of hearing it in a planetarium, and it sounds
great.
incredible. And yes, one of our attendees has asked, and so if you can speak to this, that would be great, why there hasn't been a TV or movie, like good TV or movie adaptations of Asimov's work. It seems like it would be something that works well for especially all the streaming services right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, number one, I think it actually is a perfect story in itself. I think adapting it would in some ways weaken the impact of hearing it or reading it because it's very focused, right? I mean, the thing about Asimov is that he is not a character-driven writer. These stories are not stories that generally have memorable characters. It's the ideas that I think people tend to respond to in Asimov, and so I think the story is perfect in its way. A adaptation would, I think, be very challenging. There's a secondary answer to that question that involves the Asimov estate. And it's kind of complicated. I think the short answer is that until Asimov's wife passed away a few years ago, a lot of these projects went unrealized. And there are actually much fewer adaptations of Asimov stories in general than you would expect. There's iRobot, the Will Smith movie that came out a while back, a couple of other minor works. But yeah, no, if you look at Asimov's work and people like Heinlein, other authors from the Golden Age, it is surprising how rarely they are adapted. And, in general, there are, fairly complex rights issues involved here. But the bottom line is that there actually is going to be a big adaptation of Asimov's Foundation series, which is, I believe, still in the works for Apple Plus, Apple TV. I'm very curious about how that turns out. I think I'll talk about the Foundation series in a little bit, and I think that also presents certain challenges to adaptation, but I do want to see the result.
Yes, and someone did, as you were talking, mention that in the chat too, so that'll be interesting. And I see that we are getting some more general questions, and just so all of you that are here know that I'm not ignoring you, we want to wait for Alec to present, and then we'll also have a Q&A after that. So we will address as many of those questions as we can then. And I think one last comment and question before we get into your presentation. Miriam shared that Asimov was in Baltimore multiple times for Balticon. So there's also that great connection. And then Alec, have you found, and maybe this is in your presentation too, so you can tell me to hold tight if it is, but much more about why Asimov feels like The Last Question is one of his greatest works?
Well, he talks about, I think there are a few things. I will get to this in more detail later on, because I think there are some interesting biographical answers there. For one thing, it came very easily to him. He wrote it straight out, didn't have to revise it. And he said that's something that every writer appreciates. I think, I will address this further later on. The one thing I wanted to underline is that, it was only after he began to hear it read aloud. He attended several planetarium shows, just, very similar to the readings that we just experienced. And it was around then that it began to really rise in his estimation. So I think he was able to kind of re-experience that story in the way that we just did, in a way that, authors don't often have the chance to sort of hear their stories read in that kind of context. And I think for him, it was a very powerful experience. And I think it was that, the experience of sitting with an audience in that kind of setting and hearing his words and, seeing the impact they had on people, I think made a big impression on him.
Sure. Not many writers, I think, get to experience their work in that way. So that must have been incredible. And so we are pretty good on time. It's just about 4 o'clock. So if you would like to get started, Alec, I'm really excited to hear more of your insights and what you're going to tell us about Asimov.
Okay, great. Before I move to my general presentation, I will note one last thing about The Last Question, which is that the one interesting assumption that we see in the story is that there are no aliens. There's no intelligence besides mankind in the entire universe. And this is something that we tend to see in a lot of Asimov stories. And there's a reason for this. So if I don't mention it or explain why later, please remind me, because it's actually worth talking about.
Okay. Thank you.
So my current plan, by the way, is I will talk for a little bit. I like answering questions. I think that's more engaging. So I will pause about halfway through maybe, and we can talk, see, if there are any questions at that point. And then toward the end, we can do it again. So maybe 2 breaks for Q&A if we have enough demand for it.
Yes, perfect. We will keep tabs on all the questions coming through.
Okay, great. So there's a lot to talk about. Asimov had an incredibly productive career, in some ways the most productive of any writer imaginable. And so there's much more than I can cover in one, hour. And I feel I should mention quickly other sources that you might want to go to if you are curious about Asimov. So I'm kind of obliged to mention the book Astounding, which I wrote, in which Asimov is, a key figure. He's actually the third most important figure in this book. John W. Campbell, his editor, and in some ways his surrogate father, is the central character. And I actually spent more time talking about L. Ron Hubbard, who is not a writer nearly of his stature, but he was important in his own way in this book. So if you want some Asimov information, please, I would love it if you would pick up a copy. But if you're really serious about Asimov, don't even bother with this book, because Asimov himself left behind a massive amount of autobiographical material. So this is my personal copy of his memoirs. So you can take a look, you can see how huge these books are. Okay, these are 2 volumes of his memoirs that only take his life up to 1978, and so he died in 92. All right, so this doesn't even finish the story, but volume 1 has 700 pages, volume 2 has 800 pages. These are incredibly detailed books in which Asimov essentially narrates his life almost day by day. He talks about taking his car to the garage for repairs, and yet it's really engaging. To me, it's a wonderful book. I learned a lot from it. It's one of my favorite autobiographies. So if you can track down a copy online, I think they're out of print, but they're definitely worth picking up if you're a science fiction fan. So the question is, why was someone like Asimov allowed to even write 2 huge biographies, like autobiographies like this? Most people, even most writers, don't get the chance to write a memoir that is longer than War and Peace. So what is it about Asimov, especially because his life was, in some respects, not outwardly that exciting? And the answer is he was incredibly famous. All right, this is something that I think younger science fiction fans might not appreciate. But when Asimov was alive, he was not only the most famous science fiction writer in America, but he may have been the most recognizable writer of any kind. He was someone where if you, passed him on the street, you might recognize him because he had this very distinctive look. He had these, black plastic frame glasses and, these huge sideburns. He was often on talk shows. He would do a lot of public speaking. He was a celebrity. He was a public figure in a way that, I would say no science fiction writer has been since. And that's a big part of the reason why he was able to publish, 2 enormous volumes of his memoirs, because there was an audience for it. He was famous. He was someone that people were curious about. And so when you think of Asimov, it's actually very hard to get past the public persona that he embodied. He was very good at making readers feel as though they knew him because he had this wonderful informal tone as a writer that made you feel as though you were part of this science fiction community. And, he was beloved. And it can be hard for readers, especially now, to kind of take a step back and remember, not this version of Isaac Asimov, which is the version that most of us associate with him, but this version, the young Asimov, which is the one I'm going to be talking about today. Because this first volume of his memoirs, 700 pages. This is the time in his life that kind of made him who he was. All right, and during this period, he was not famous. He was well regarded, from a fairly early age within science fiction circles. But for the next 20 minutes, while I talk about Asimov, who I want you to picture is not the, big plastic glasses, sideburned celebrity figure, but this man, right? This is his high school portrait. Asimov as a young man, because the one thing that you kind of start to understand about him once you've spent enough time, at least I have, thinking about his life, is that he always felt like an outsider. And this is something that he talks about, something that he dealt with, for at least his early manhood, let's say, and probably after that. He never felt like he really belonged. And, there are a lot of reasons for this, and one big one is that he was a Russian Jew. He was an immigrant. He was born in Russia, a village called Petrovichi in 1920, and came over to America with his parents when he was 3 years old. So from a very early age, he was an immigrant in a new country. He didn't speak English when he immigrated. He was Jewish. He was a prodigy. He was, by far the smartest person in the room from a very early age. And, these are all things that set him apart. All right. These are things that make it hard for him to feel embraced and welcomed by others. And this is something that, you see, in his work, from a very early point. He's also cut off from his peers by the fact that, I'll get to that in a second. The other thing that I want to mention quickly is that, the Asimovs, they were Jewish. They were not particularly observant Jews. They did not really go to synagogue. He never had a bar mitzvah, and he identified pretty early on as an atheist. All right, so for him, his Jewishness was defined by the way in which it became an issue as he worked through life, because he did confront anti-Semitism and other issues like that, later on. He didn't really have much of a social life. He worked in his father's candy store. His father had a candy store in Brooklyn, and Asimov, during grade school was expected to work there after school, and so he didn't really have a social life. He, was very isolated. So this is kind of the key point, because what happens is that the one thing about having a candy store in Brooklyn in the 1930s is that you have access to pulp magazines. All right, and Asimov always talks about how he was lucky because of his father's store. He could read these for free. And so when Asimov, was working in his father's candy store, he starts seeing copies of a magazine called Astounding Science Fiction. All right, now these issues that I have are from a slightly later period, but you can kind of understand the appeal that they would have to a young man like him. All right, so he's reading these magazines very carefully because they have to be resold, after he's finished with them. But he reads everything. He becomes obsessed with science fiction. And the first community that he really belongs to is science fiction fandom, which is emerging in New York City around this time. He's invited to join a club called the Futurians, which includes future writers like Donald Wollheim and Frederick Pohl. These are also outsiders. These are people like Asimov. Many of them are Jewish. Many, think of themselves as communists. They are nerdy. They are young, nerdy men. And, the dynamics in fandom in New York in the 1930s are actually very similar to the dynamics that we see in fandom today. The same kinds of flame wars and brigading and these controversies between clubs, those impulses haven't changed. So this is why science fiction, it bears remembering now that, science fiction has kind of expanded to fill the entire pop culture landscape. And so it can be kind of hard to remember that, in 1938, let's say, it was a subculture on top of a subculture. There were plenty of readers of science fiction, but only a tiny minority of those readers organized themselves into fan clubs. They couldn't go online, so they had to meet in person. They would exchange these mimeographed fanzines and write letters, to the magazines and find each other that way. So, this is a community that is, very small, that kind of is able to coalesce in cities like New York and Philadelphia and Los Angeles, where there's a critical mass of fans in the same place. And this is the, matrix in which Asimov emerges. He was a fan first. He began, reading science fiction, when he was in his teens, and he loved it. And this is before he, ever, had thoughts of becoming a writer. And this is interesting because, the pulps at that point, I don't have time to go into the entire history of the science fiction pulps, but the first decade or so of the pulps, these stories are mostly written by pulp authors who are already prominent in other genres. So if you're a pulp writer like L. Ron Hubbard, for example, and you've written a lot of science, or you've written a lot of nautical fiction or adventure fiction or Westerns, you just take those stock plots and you transfer them to science fiction. And you say, okay, this is a cowboy story, but it's set on Mars. And that's kind of the level of engagement that the first wave of science fiction writers had in America for the pulps. But then about the time Asimov starts to get old enough to start thinking about writing for himself, you're seeing the first generation of science fiction fans who have grown up with the genre. They love science fiction. They aren't just writing it for the money. They write it because they love it and they want to be science fiction writers. And so this is a crucial moment in the history of science fiction, because it's the first time that you have people that grew up reading these stories who actually are, at a place where they can start to write for themselves. So Asimov is, 18 years old. All right. So I want you to remember how young he is at this point. And what he does is he writes a science fiction story. It's called Cosmic Corkscrew. And it's not very good, but it exists. He's going to send it someplace. And the first place he wants to send it is Astounding, because for him, that's the best magazine by far on the market. So he actually is lucky because he lives in Brooklyn and the offices of Astounding are in Manhattan. And it's just a fairly straightforward train ride to get there. So he decides, instead of mailing the story, he's going to take the train to the offices of Astounding and put it into the hands of the editor, who is a man named John W. Campbell. So a couple of things. If Asimov had lived anywhere else but New York City, it would never have occurred to him to, well, it might never have occurred to him to write in the first place, but certainly he never could have gone there in person. All right. So this is a huge stroke of luck, not just for Asimov, but for science fiction as a whole. Because what happens is that, Asimov takes the train up to the Astounding offices and meets Campbell for the first time. And Campbell kind of takes Asimov under his wing. He sees Asimov as almost like the first example of a fan who wants to be a writer. And, Campbell has been working for the most part with older writers, people like Hubbard in many cases, who have established careers elsewhere. And he's wondering to himself, so what if I have a young guy who is eager and a fan and is willing to be instructed? What can I turn him into? And he sort of takes on Asimov as a test subject. Now, Campbell is a very complicated figure in his own right, and I don't really have time to discuss his story, but suffice to say, Campbell is still, also a young man. He's 27 years old when he takes over Astounding. He also is a science fiction writer first. He wrote the story Who Goes There, which was later adapted into the movie The Thing. So, hugely talented, also an outsider, also a weird, extremely strange person who kind of stumbles into the editorship of Astounding. He isn't really seeking it, but the job opens up at just the right time. He's available, and so you have this very unusual person suddenly placed in a role of power where he can serve as a gatekeeper and kind of the overseer of science fiction, because Campbell has plans. Campbell looks at the science fiction and he sees the quality of the stories that have been published to date. And he says, we can do better. We can improve the science. We can write better characters. We can make the writing a little better, and really talk about things, like cultural change. We're not talking just about spaceships and ray guns. We're going to talk about societies and talk about psychology and all these things that Campbell had in mind. So when Asimov sort of stumbles into Campbell's office, he's entering this experiment that has kind of been ongoing without him even realizing it. And, from Campbell's point of view, he's the perfect test subject because he's clearly intelligent. He's not a good writer. The first 8 stories that he submits to Campbell get rejected, but they keep meeting. Campbell says, come see me. And so Asimov will take the train up and meet in person, get feedback. Campbell will give him advice and notes on his stories. And, over the course of about a year, mentors Asimov to the point where he finally makes his first sale. And at that point, Asimov is 19. So he likes to say that he was a slow learner, that those first stories, were pretty amateurish, but, he's very young. All right. And already he's getting into print, which is not something that most science fiction fans at that point are doing. None of his friends in the Futurians have broken through to Campbell yet. So it's a big deal. And again, this is not the Asimov that we are familiar with. This is a bespectacled, skinny kid of 19 who is in awe of Campbell, who's maybe 10 years older than he is, but wants to please this editor. This is a man whose work he admires, a magazine that he loves, and so he's willing to do pretty much whatever Campbell wants. And so you see this interesting pattern over the next year or two, where Asimov, he's still trying to write stories and submit them to Campbell and other editors, and not having that much success. He doesn't really break through as a leading writer, for a while, and he does much better when he works directly with Campbell. on ideas that Campbell either suggests to him or assigns to him. And this will tie into Nightfall, which I'll be talking about in a second. So I mentioned earlier that yeah, the last question stands out because there are no aliens. And there's a reason for this. So Campbell is not an editor who is sort of passively accepting submissions as they come over the transom. He is shaping the magazine. He has certain ideas about what science fiction should be. And his prejudices and his preconceived notions, really shaped what that magazine published, and it's kind of, at this stage was laying down the rules, defining what science fiction was going to be. And, one of Campbell's sort of hobby horses was the idea that in a science fiction story, the human being, the human main character had to always win over the aliens. And not only did they always have to win, but they had to be smarter than the aliens or superior to the aliens in some way. And this really bothered Asimov. He thought it constrained the kind of stories that he could tell. And, there were some cases where he wanted to write a story, but realized that Campbell wouldn't take it because it depicted aliens in a different way than Campbell liked. So what Asimov decides is, I'm just not going to write aliens. I'm going to have a story. I'm going to have stories that take place in a universe where there are only human beings. And this is interesting because this, it affects not just the stories that he writes at this point, but, the Foundation series, probably his most famous series, for the most part takes place in a universe where there are only humans. And this comes directly out of Campbell. This comes out of the 19-year-old Asimov reacting against the 28-year-old Campbell and deciding to write stories that will allow him to have a small amount of freedom as a writer. So the other thing that ends up happening is that so if you can't write about aliens and you're writing science fiction, where do you go? And in Asimov's case, it was robots, because robots they fell outside those notions that Campbell had about aliens. And so, Asimov realizes pretty early on that if he starts to write robot stories for Campbell, he can sort of avoid the entire issue of humans vis-a-vis aliens. So he submits a couple of stories to Campbell about robots. These are stories that will eventually be collected under the title I, Robot. So these are immensely influential stories. And, and again, so Campbell is mentoring Asimov. They meet in the office on a regular basis so that Campbell can give Asimov advice. And, one day they're discussing a story that Asimov has just submitted. And Campbell is just sort of chatting with him. And he says, look, Asimov, in working this out, you have to realize that there are 3 rules that robots have to follow. In the first place, they can't do any harm to human beings. In the second place, they have to obey orders without doing harm. And in the third, they have to protect themselves without doing harm or proving disobedient. So these are the rules that, after some refinement, will become known as the 3 laws of robotics, which in some ways are Asimov's most influential contribution to science fiction, as well as to the fields of robotics and AI. And they came from Campbell. This is Campbell talking to Asimov. And later on he says, oh, these were implicit in your earlier stories, but that's not really true. This is Campbell kind of just, talking freely in his office. And, he sort of tosses off this idea that, Asimov, will later use and, take much further than Campbell ever did. But, it speaks to that relationship, the closeness they had and the respect that Asimov had for Campbell. So we're at a point now where Asimov is getting published more often, but he's still not a top tier writer. Campbell, if asked, he would say, my best writers are probably Heinlein, Hubbard, A.E. Van Vogt, Ellis Briggs de Camp, Lester Del Rey, maybe a few others. Asimov is not even in the conversation. For Campbell, Asimov is still sort of like the fan who wants to be a writer who occasionally comes up with interesting stuff when you give him enough time. But he's not that impressed by what Asimov has been doing so far. And that changes almost overnight, because on one of their periodic meetings at Campbell's office in New York, Asimov shows up and he has an idea that he wants to talk about, but Campbell says, no, I actually have an idea that I want you to write. And Campbell reads him a line from an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And the line is, if the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many, many generations the remembrance of the city of God which had been shown? Then Campbell puts the book down and he says, what do you think would happen, Asimov, if men were to see the stars for the first time in 1,000 years? And Asimov says, I don't know. And Campbell says, I think they would go mad. I want you to write a story about that. So this story becomes Nightfall, which we're going to be reading together, in a little bit. And, this story does not come out of nowhere. Okay, this story reflects Campbell's, two of Campbell's major obsessions. One is psychology. He thinks that if mankind is presented with this vision of its insignificance for the first time when it sees the stars, the entire, they wouldn't be able to handle it, that they would have some kind of mental breakdown, on a mass scale. Because Campbell, is obsessed by psychology. He is an ambitious editor who wants to write stories that, as I said earlier, kind of expand past the conventions of science fiction that have been established in the pulps to explore things like the mind. The 3 laws of robotics are also an expression of this, because you could say that the 3 laws are also an attempt to reduce human psychology to some basic rules. The idea of psychology as an exact science is one that you see again and again in the Campbellian period for this magazine, and it eventually mutates into a very strange form, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. The second big theme that Nightfall covers is the cyclical rise and fall of civilizations. All right, so Campbell is obsessed by the idea of, can there be a science of history? Can we look at the patterns that we see in past societies and use those to predict what happens later on? And around the time that he pitches Nightfall to Asimov, he's working with writers like Jack Williamson and Elsbeth de Camp on stories and essays that explore this exact question. Can there be a science of history? Can there be a science of predicting the future? And this will pay off very shortly in the Foundation stories. So when Campbell tells Asimov to write Nightfall, he is not just randomly picking a sentence from Emerson and saying, oh, this might be worthwhile. He is recruiting Asimov into a program, into a project that he is already developing with other writers. And Asimov says later on, he has no idea whether Campbell had actually meant to give him that story idea, or whether he was just the author who happened to wander into the office that day. And if he hadn't gone, Campbell would have given it to somebody else. So Asimov goes home. He writes Nightfall. He and Campbell have kind of discussed the science of, how could you have a planet that, didn't see night for centuries. But he writes the story, and it is a masterpiece. It turns Asimov overnight from a second-tier writer into a science fiction writer of the first rank. Campbell gives him a bonus, which has never happened before. It runs on the cover of Astounding. It gets a huge response from fans. In 1968, it was actually voted the greatest science fiction story of all time. So it kind of, it makes Asimov. Like, without that story, his entire career in science fiction would be very different. And then a few months later, he goes to Campbell, and he wants to pitch an idea of his own, the way he has in the past. And he says, I want to write a story about the rise and fall of a galactic empire. And Campbell says, great. But let's also add this idea, which is the idea of a science of history, a science of prediction. And Campbell and Asimov come up with the idea of what is later called psychohistory, which is basically an attempt to reduce history to symbolic logic, to be able to predict events with total accuracy, even centuries into the future. And so that becomes Foundation, the first story in the Foundation series. And if you look back at Nightfall, in that context, you see that Nightfall is actually kind of a prelude to the Foundation series. It is a story that assumes that there are cycles in societies, and in Nightfall, there's no solution. It's not in the original story. It ends, I mean, I'm not going to spoil it for people that haven't heard it yet, but it does not end well. And Foundation says maybe there is an alternative. Maybe there are ways in which we can use the knowledge that certain things have happened before, and forestall or change what we think might actually happen if we don't act. So all these stories are part of a sequence. All right. And they are a sequence that is determined largely by Campbell. Campbell is either giving Asimov ideas, or he's imposing ideas on the stories that Asimov submits to make them fit into the sequence of stories that he's developing. So the result, I think Asimov himself would agree, are classics. Nightfall, is a classic. The Foundation series, as we mentioned, is so famous that there's going to be a big TV adaptation, fairly soon. But when Asimov is asked, what are your favorite stories? What are the best stories that you have written? He's very emphatic about this. He does not think Nightfall is in the top 3. He does not even mention any of the Foundation stories. He says The Last Question. And, I think when we get to part 2 of this presentation, I'm going to try to figure out why. I think that's a good time to break. Maybe, do we have any questions from the audience?
Hi, Alec. Thank you. So just a quick reminder to everybody, if you can drop your questions into the Q&A feature. I am learning so much from the chat that's going on between everyone, and it's amazing to see the way in which you guys are just really taking this conversation into so many brilliant directions, and especially so excited to see Hitchhikers pop up there as well. For those of you joining us on Facebook, if I can remind you, if you pop your questions into the comment section, and then we'll make sure they get over to Alec. But yeah, sorry, I didn't finish that sentence before. If you can use the Q&A, it makes sure the questions don't get lost amongst all of the other chat. Oh, okay, here's a really fun question to start with. So, Alec, can you tell us Asimov's other top 2 stories?
Yes. So he was very consistent in saying that his top 3 were The Last Question, The Bicentennial Man, which is a great story that was adapted into a movie as well, and a story called The Ugly Little Boy, all of which are great, and which I encourage you all to seek out.
Yeah, hopefully this conversation today will inspire you to go out and keep reading more Asimov. Okay, we've got another question here where I'm going to guess that we might have a slight typo, but I could be wrong. Someone's sort of suggesting the idea that perhaps Asimov was the equivalent of his time of maybe George R.R. Martin, or I'm going to guess that's maybe Neil Gaiman. I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit for us, Alec.
I'm going to talk about this, down the line a little bit. So Asimov, there's no question that he was the most famous science fiction writer in the world during his lifetime. In the sense that George R.R. Martin, I think, is the most famous science fiction / fantasy writer in America right now, and also a guy you recognize. George, he wears the same hat. He's got that beard and glasses. He is a known celebrity in a way that very few writers have ever gotten to. Neil Gaiman, probably, unlike George and Asimov, he could probably walk down the street and not get totally accosted. But again, someone who certainly has broken through to the mainstream and, represents the genre as sort of like an ambassador of science fiction and fantasy, to general readers. The one thing I will add that I will explore later on is that when Asimov becomes famous in the mainstream, it's not for his science fiction, at least not early on, it's for his nonfiction. He becomes known as a popular science writer and as sort of like a general explainer, the world's greatest teacher, and there's no one like that right now, at least no one who combines those 2 roles in one the way he did. So I think his role is actually still pretty unique.
Fantastic. That's really interesting to think about it in that way. Just to confirm, we did see, I saw someone pop up in the chat a second ago asking what the second book was. I think you already had That Ugly Little Boy, and I think the other one was Bicentennial Man.
Bicentennial
Is that
Man.
right?
Yes.
Thank you for confirming. Okay, wow, we've got lots of questions in the Q&A, so maybe we'll just pull a couple out and then we'll let Alec wrap up and then we'll come back to them again, but let's do a couple more. Okay, brilliant question, I think. What kind of books did Asimov himself like to read?
Good question. So he grew up reading, he was a voracious reader. Like, he talks about going to the library, getting a library card was a huge deal for him. He would, walk home with like a book in front of his face and, two others tucked under each arm. So he read everything. Some of the stories that I know that he loved, he read a lot of history. The Foundation series comes out of his love of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which he read twice, at that point, which is pretty impressive. He read the Iliad and the Odyssey. He loved the Homeric poems. He loved Gilbert and Sullivan. He, and he loves science fiction, right? So the thing about, Asimov that I like to underline is that, the science fiction that he read growing up is not stuff that generally holds up. There are very few stories from that period that people still read, but he was shaped by writers like E.E. Smith, who was a huge, success in the pulps, from the late 20s onward. He was influenced. He was one of the most, voracious readers imaginable growing up. And it's really obvious when you look at his work, the impact is certainly visible.
Okay, I want to take a slight step back with one of these questions. I'm trying to make sure I don't ask questions that are likely going to come up in the second half of your presentation. So Asimov's science essays were more plentiful than his fiction. Would you be able to comment on any favorite essay he had or favorite topic to write upon?
Well, he wrote about everything. I mean, one amazing thing about Asimov is that he clearly started out writing about science. His first two nonfiction books were textbooks. He was a professor of biochemistry, and so, he could sort of make a case for himself, writing this sort of thing. He began to write science essays for Campbell and for science fiction magazines that gradually kind of expanded the range of topics that he could write about. And his goal, which he eventually reached, was to get to the point where he could write a nonfiction book about anything, and people would buy it. So you get Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare, and you get Asimov's Guide to the Bible. He was very curious. There are very few things he didn't write about. One famous trivia fact about Asimov is that he has books in every single category of the Dewey Decimal System except for one. So there are very few writers who have written on as many different topics as he has. I will flag one book that I think might be worth reading is he wrote a book, and I don't know the exact date, but it's called A Choice of Catastrophes. And this was the first book of his that I read, the first nonfiction book that I read. And it is a nonfiction exploration of different ways the world could end, including, how do we turn back the increase in entropy? So it's a scientific look at the question that the last question poses. And Asimov has some pretty interesting suggestions that he doesn't get to cover in the story.
That's fascinating, thank you. Okay, I think maybe if Alec, if you feel ready to go ahead, and then we'll come back to the questions that we've still got here when you wrap up. And just as a reminder for everyone in the audience, please feel free to keep dropping questions into the Q&A for when Alec finishes his presentation. Thanks so much.
So I've talked about Campbell's obsession with a science of history. I haven't really talked about why. And the main reason is World War II. So all these stories and these interactions are happening against a backdrop of the Nazi invasion of Europe and the question of what's going to happen to the United States. All these stories were written before Pearl Harbor. And so, there's obviously like a lot of pent up anxiety. It's a time, much like our own time, of uncertainty, and people are wondering what's going to happen. And, you can say that the Foundation series, which essentially, is about how do you predict events for centuries into the future, is a reaction to the uncertainty over what's going to happen in Europe tomorrow. And so those impulses, come directly out of the war. So I'm going to skip over the war, which is a very interesting period for the story, because, I don't think I have time to go into all of it. The one thing that we should point out is that, after the war, Asimov is in a very different place than he was before the war. in terms of Campbell. He is now a name writer. He's written a bunch of foundation stories, including The Mule, which I think is probably the best story in that series. And he's probably one of the top 3 or 4 writers in the field. And so he's starting to very slowly assert his independence from Campbell. All right, and he still loves Campbell, reveres him, sees him as a mentor. But he's already kind of trying to decide, what kind of writer am I without Campbell? What happens if Campbell dies? What happens if he goes away? And Campbell doesn't die, but they do become estranged. And it's a very long story as to what happens. But Campbell eventually becomes obsessed by the idea, as I said before, of a science of the mind. The way, the same interest that fed into the 3 laws of robotics and, even Nightfall to some extent, can psychology be reduced to a science? And this is a theme that is there in the science fiction stories he's publishing before the war. And after the war, Campbell becomes obsessed with this idea because of the bomb. He's terrified of the prospect of nuclear war. And he decides that the only way to avoid it is to reduce human psychology to a science. And he does this with a writer named L. Ron Hubbard. And they partner up. They work on a new kind of mental health therapy, which eventually becomes Scientology. This is much later, but Campbell publishes the earliest versions of that therapy in the magazine. And Asimov hates it. He is dead set against Dianetics, which is what it's called. And so that's one issue. All right, so that estranges them for a little bit. Another issue is Campbell becomes interested in stuff like psychic powers. He still wants to make a great discovery. Campbell is sort of like a guy who always wanted to be an inventor or a scientist. And when he didn't become either of those things, he said, okay, well, maybe I will discover something through the magazine. Maybe one of my writers, these geniuses I have writing for me, maybe one of them will come up with something, that's going to change the world for real. And, he ends up focusing on what he calls psionics, these weird machines that you're supposed to control with your mind, or that have these unexplained properties, that don't obey the laws of physics. And he puts these as nonfiction articles in the magazine because he wants readers to build these machines at home and experiment with them on their own. And Asimov, who's for all his other, issues, an arch rationalist in some ways, is scandalized. He can't believe that this man he respects would deign to devote space in the magazine to these totally unfounded, wild ideas. So there's that. There's the fact that Asimov moves to Boston, and so they aren't meeting anymore. They're separated geographically. And the last factor, which I should bring up, is so Campbell was racist. All right, he was a racist in all kinds of ways that were obvious in his editorials and his letters and his conversations. And around the time of the civil rights movement, let's say, the mid-50s onward, it becomes really hard for Asimov to ignore. And they have an exchange over segregation of letters that really alienates Asimov. And he starts to wonder whether he can write for Campbell ever again. And this is where the last question comes in. All right, so 1956. This is years after, those first encounters in New York. Asimov is now a well-known science fiction writer in his own right, and he's not sure he can write for Campbell. And there are other magazines at this point. When they first started working together, Astounding was pretty much the only game in town if you were a ambitious writer. But now, there's Galaxy, there's fantasy and science fiction. There are other magazines that you can write for. And so Asimov has other markets besides Campbell, which is another huge factor as to why they eventually kind of have a falling out. And he's a friend named Robert Lowndes, who was one of the Futurians. This is one of the nerdy guys who he was friends with in New York in the late 30s. And Lowndes has a magazine called Science Fiction Quarterly. And he says, do you want to write for this magazine? And, the issue is that Lowndes doesn't have any money. He does not pay a lot, whereas Campbell is still paying the top rates in the field. But, Asimov says, yes, I will write for you. And, what's more, I'm not going to give you like some bottom drawer story that, I couldn't sell elsewhere. I will write a story just for you as if I were writing it for Campbell, and you will pay me the astounding rates for that story. And Lowndes says yes. So this is very revealing. So Asimov is basically saying, I want to write as if I'm writing for Campbell, but not actually write for Campbell, because he doesn't want to go there anymore, at least not on the fiction side. And for Lowland, that's a great deal. And it pays off right away because he writes the last question. So the last question, what Asimov believes is the greatest science fiction story that he has ever written, that maybe anyone has ever written, does not appear in Astounding, does not appear in the magazine that made his name. It appears in this totally, kind of minor magazine, Science Fiction Quarterly. But it's fine because Asimov doesn't need to be in Campbell's magazine anymore. He has his own name now. And so I think a big part of the reason why the last question stands out to Asimov is that this is a great story that he wrote without Campbell's input, without any ideas from Campbell, without any editorial feedback from Campbell. He's on his own now. He doesn't need this man who he loves and also has such complicated feelings towards. And so apart from the story's obvious quality, I think that's also why he ranks it higher than Nightfall, because Nightfall, which is a great story, was a story that Campbell played a large role in conceiving. The last question, it's all Asimov. It's all Asimov. And so I think that that's a big part of the reason why he ranks that story so highly. The other big thing that happens to Asimov around this point is a few years later, Sputnik, or like a year later, Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, goes into orbit and obviously causes a crisis in America. And the crisis is about science education. People are worried that we're going to fall behind the Soviets, when it comes to technology and teaching children about the things that are going to be essential to our survival as a nation. And Asimov basically says, why am I wasting my time writing science fiction when I could be the world's best popular science writer? And there's a market for this stuff now. Campbell likes to publish this stuff, so he can work with Campbell again without having to worry about submitting stories. He can publish in science fiction magazines, but he can also publish in mainstream magazines. He can publish textbooks, later books, of popular science and other subjects, as I just said. And he kind of stops being a science fiction writer for a while. He says, it's much more important for me to write nonfiction. And so he starts to write and write and write. This is where he becomes famous, because the one thing about Asimov that I haven't really talked about that we should definitely underline is that he wrote more than anyone. And there's actually a quote that I like to read from the playwright David Mamet, which I think shed some light on Asimov's amazing productivity. So, Mamet is asked, why he writes, and he says, I've got to do it anyway, like beavers, they chop, they eat wood, because if they don't, their teeth grow too long and they die. And they hate the sound of running water. It drives them crazy. So if you put those two things together, they are going to build dams. So what does this have to do with Asimov? So if you were to construct the most prolific writer who ever lived from first principles, you would probably end up with someone like Isaac Asimov. Why? He's a good typist. He hates traveling, right? He hates flying. He never flies on a plane except once in his life. He likes enclosed spaces. He loved being in like the back of the candy store. He loved, being in little rooms in his attic office. So he just likes being at home. He is an incredible, his retention of information, his memory is fantastic. And, he's perfected this kind of informal prose style that reads really well, that readers respond to. And he kind of perfects a kind of nonfiction where he is essentially writing from other reference books. So he will write Asimov's Guide to Quasars or Asimov's, Guide to Physics. And, he has a typewriter and he has a reference book next to him on his desk. And he's kind of like typing and looking over and not just paraphrasing, but, transforming this information into a form that regular readers can understand. And that is a recipe for an incredibly productive career. You put this guy in a room for a full working day and he can just crank out books. And this is what happens. I mean, he writes 400 books before he dies. Some of those books are books that he edited or, wrote introductions to. And so, you could sense that he kind of padded his book count. But, number one, he knew that this was what he was going to be most famous for. He was going to be most famous for being the most prolific author in American history. And, you know, more than anything else, that's what made him a celebrity. I think if you looked at people, you know, not science fiction fans, but in the mainstream, when they thought of Asimov, they thought of the guy who wrote hundreds of books. So yeah, and he does this despite the fact that he dies at a relatively early age. He dies at 72. He actually dies of AIDS because he acquires HIV, you know, after a blood transfusion during heart surgery. But, you know, at the time of his death, there was no question. He is the most famous science fiction writer in the world, in part because of, you know, his appearance, in part because he's good on talk shows, but also, you know, he's sort of the face of science fiction. You know, he is the first person that you think of if you're an American in 1970 when you're asked to think of a science fiction writer. So in a way, you know, he started, as I said, as an outsider. And, you know, by the time of his death, he became what you might call the ultimate insider, but someone who made it feel like you're part of that club, you were part of that community. And I think that's what a lot of people responded to. You know, he was a Toastmaster, an MC at science fiction conventions, at award ceremonies. You know, he was active in fandom until he died. It was, you know, a big part of his legacy. So that leads me to something that I haven't discussed yet, which I feel I need to, because it's a bigger part of Asimov's legacy, I think, as his books, and it hasn't really been talked about. So he was a serial groper. All right, this might seem like an abrupt transition, but, you know, Asimov wrote hundreds of books over the course of his career, but, you know, it's pretty clear from his own, you know, memoirs and account of his behavior that he probably groped hundreds of women over the course of decades. And these are, you know, this includes unwanted touching, kissing, fondling. It became a running joke at conventions. You know, these were often young women fans, secretaries, people that he met at parties. He was known as a groper. And this needs to be underlined, I think, because it was common knowledge, and it was accepted and condoned and even laughed at because he was so beloved, right? You know, Asimov famously kind of embodied this, you know, he had this act as a dirty old man that he would sort of put on for people at conventions. But, you know, that was who he really was. You know, he touched women, you know, for decades. And, you know, I know firsthand from, you know, like accounts of people who were on the receiving end that it was traumatizing. You know, it really hurt a lot of women. And it was, you know, not only disgraceful in its own sake, but it also sent a message to his admirers. You know, as I said, I mean, Asimov was the face of science fiction. He was the most famous person in the room at any convention he went to. And he was a person who, you know, people looked at for examples of how to behave. And so, you know, I think there's a very real sense in that his behavior toward women, which was treated as a joke, really affected the way that community dealt with women for a very long time. And it's never been talked about, or, you know, it's very rarely been talked about, in part because people, you know, including me, you know, they have such affection for him in other ways. But the more I think about Asimov, the more you know, I've come to believe that those two parts of him are inseparable. I think about the young Asimov, the outsider, who finds other outsiders and, you know, forms one of the first science fiction clubs. And, you know, you see this again today. You see examples of people who feel like they've been ostracized or excluded from other groups, forming their own group and then excluding others. People like women, you know, people of color, you know, who don't look like them. And, you know, I think Asimov, you look at his, you know, work, where are the women? You know, there are not women in these stories for the most part. His fan letters from when he was growing up, you know, are incredibly hostile towards women fans. And, you know, I think that informed his behavior. I think that informed, you know, the way he treated them at conventions and in his private life. And I think, you know, it has to be talked about because he is so beloved. He is so important to people. That, you know, he raises a lot of issues, you know, the question of, you know, at what point does a community of people like science fiction, you know, that is so important to the people that belong to that world, At what point does it need to question the ways in which it behaves towards others, people that don't fit into those categories? I think Asimov is, probably the greatest test case imaginable for that problem, and I think that's the real last question. All right, maybe I'll pause there, see if anyone wants to weigh in.
So I guess first, Alec, I just want to say thank you for you addressing that. I think that echoes sentiments of what we're seeing in the chat as well. So thank you. Okay,
Sure.
let's move to some of the questions that we've got here, which we have about 10 minutes. So I'm not sure we're going to get through all of them, but I'm going to try and ask you as many as we possibly can. So let's start out with this top one we've got here. Someone's said, I've always wondered if Asimov meant for his story The Last Answer to be a sort of sequel to The Last Question. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I just looked up that story today because I was like, what's that story about? Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly meant to evoke that story. It's a sort of afterlife fantasy about I haven't read it in a long time. It's about a man who dies and he meets God and sort of talks about what the purpose of mankind really is. I don't know much about that story. I mean, the one thing I can share is that Asimov was an atheist. He did not believe in an afterlife. And, he talks about this because he knew he was dying toward the end. He wrote, many articles or like pieces about his mortality. And he said he doesn't believe that there's anything after this. I think that's worth noting because The Last Question, which is a much more famous story, this is a story about transcendence. It's about a story about immortality, but it's a scientific immortality. And, that's the kind of answer that Asimov, I think, was willing to speculate about. But as far as the rest is concerned, I don't think he believed that there is anything after this life.
I wonder, touching on sort of building on that, someone did ask, did he ever get pushback for being an outspoken atheist?
It's a good question. I don't know offhand. I don't know. That's actually a good question. I don't believe that he would have gotten pushback from the people that he cared most about. I think, within science fiction fandom, I doubt that was an issue. Frankly, I think anti-Semitism was a bigger issue for him, at least early on. He talks about that a great deal, not just, from, other fans, but also Campbell himself, had fairly complex feelings toward the Jews. He had issues with this in the Navy Yard and, in various other settings professionally. So I think he was much more defined by that.
Okay, one that we're getting a lot of people want to know about Asimov's relationship with Harlan Ellison. Can you talk to us a little about that, please?
Yeah. I've talked about Campbell as sort of this mentor figure to Asimov, and he kind of became a surrogate father. And in part, this is because Asimov was not that close to his own father. I mean, Judah Asimov was, from what I understand, a good man who was just at the candy store. He was always working. He never really had a chance to spend time with his son. And by the time, of like the late 30s, I mean, Campbell and Asimov are talking more often than Asimov talked to his own father. And so that kind of mentorship, that kind of relationship, clearly was important to Asimov. He had a son, David Asimov, who is still alive, who ended up being a very problematic person for reasons I'm not going to talk about now. But they were not close. They were not close at all. He was close to his daughter, but he didn't really have a son who he could kind of see as a successor, in a way that I think he wanted. And so he kind of recreated the Campbell, mentorship with other people. And one of them was Ellison. And this is interesting to me because Ellison is kind of famously combative. He is a sort of a, little incredibly articulate, but, hot-tempered guy who gets into fights, right? He's known for, being that kind of person. And so he and Asimov, they would kind of publicly engage in these bouts at conventions where they would face off and trade insults. And it was a lot of fun. People really enjoyed it. But it was an act, because deep down, Ellison loved Asimov. It was an incredibly powerful friendship, and I think Asimov did mentor Ellison in a way that he felt Campbell had done for him.
Okay, let's do next. What do you think Asimov would make of social media, both as a technology and as an effect upon us?
That's a good question. So the one thing about science fiction that I like to talk about is how it never saw any of this stuff coming, or very little of it was reflected in the science fiction of this period. You look at Last Question and its vision of computing, and it's these like planetary sized computers that clearly by the time let's say Asimov died, it was clear that computers would look nothing like this sort of multi-vac universal AC that he talks about. So there's that. Asimov never really talks about computing in any, I'll say, like any kind of meaningful way. There are some exceptions in other stories from that period, some stories that do seem to, look ahead. There's a story called A Logic Named Joe by Will Jenkins that I think comes pretty close to foreseeing aspects of the internet. As for social media, I'm not sure. I think Asimov, as I said, came up in fandom, all right? And he was very familiar with the dynamics of certain communities. And what social media has done is accelerate and amplify those impulses. So in 1935, if you were a fan and you had a beef with another fan group, you could send a letter, to a magazine, or you could write a newsletter and wait for responses. But these disputes took place in person, or they took place over the course of weeks and weeks, in paper form. And I think, I can't say for sure, but I think Asimov would recognize the fact that these behaviors haven't changed. And if anything, they've only gotten more extreme because of the technology that we have now to facilitate them.
Thank you. I'm going to jump to a question that we got in from Facebook next, I think. Who do you think is Asimov's best female character? They say they think his strongest is Dr. Calvin, but she regularly faced misogyny by other characters. Would you agree?
I'm not a huge fan of Susan Calvin. So this is the main character in the Robot series. I know that people like her. I don't. I think she's a very limited character, and I think she reflects Asimov's limited sense of, women at that time. All right. When he wrote the Robot, the stories, he'd never been on a date. He didn't really know a lot of women except, a few through science fiction circles. I could name a handful of female characters or women in those stories that I think are well done, but it's an issue, all right? It's one that I don't think he ever entirely transcended, and it's a big limitation. I think it really constrained the kind of stories that he could write, and I think it shows. I think that's one reason why, as important a figure as he is historically, that a lot of those stories and novels are kind of hard to read these days.
Right, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, I think there's one question here that we need to get back to from earlier about the books that Asimov wrote. So there's been a couple follow-up questions about what category it is within the Dewey Decimal System that he didn't write in. And I guess to also specify, like, it's a broad category within the Dewey Decimal System that he didn't write, not...
Right. Yeah. So, do we have any librarians here? I don't know. As far as I can recall, that the Dewey Decimal System, it's by hundreds. And it's like each 100-sized category of the system, he has at least one book. And the exception is philosophy. I believe it's 0 through 100. There's no Asimov book under philosophy, which I think is strange, because I think if you took his essays and kind of looked through them, you could probably put together a book called Asimov on Philosophy that would fill that gap. So I encourage the Asimov estate, if they're listening, to get on that.
Fantastic. Well, this will be available online, so we'll just send them a link of it afterwards, and hopefully they'll embrace that. So I think that just about wraps up all of our questions, I think. Oh, sorry, one last one. Any studies that Asimov particularly enjoyed educating himself in?
So any what? Say again?
I think it's like any subjects, any topics that Asimov particularly enjoyed learning about himself.
Sure. He loved history. I think that comes through in his novels. I think he returns to historical themes quite a bit. But, you know, he would read, you know, there are these big encyclopedic works of history that, you know, he would just like kind of read cover to cover. And, you know, that's certainly, you know, clearer in the Foundation series and in some of the subjects that he chooses for his nonfiction later on. So I would say, yes, I would say clearly, professionally speaking, he was a scientist, you know, he knew that material extremely well, but I think history was his secret love.
Thank you so much. So
Thank you.
Thank you, Alec. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking us through so much of Asimov and really helping us understand these pieces that we're talking about today. I think this sort of connecting piece, at least from my understanding, has been absolutely fascinating. And I hope it looks like folks in the audience agree. So just a couple of little things in 1 minute. I'm going to hand over to Tracy, who's going to set us up for our second reading. But first, a couple of small reminders. So just again, when you exit the program, you'll be sent to a survey. Please take a minute to fill that out for us. It really helps us in our planning. And then next up, we just wanted to tell you, so the JMM has dedicated January to science fiction literature. So we've obviously got our program this evening. Last week, we did a great program that'll be up online in partnership with the Yiddish Book Center. But I really wanted to tell folks about a program we have coming up on January 21st at 7 p.m. So we're going to be hosting Writing Ourselves into the Narrative, Maryland Sci-Fi Writers. We welcome a panel of writers who will share not just how they came to the genre, but how they have used their own lives and experiences to create a diverse and inspiring future on the page. So we very much hope you can join us. We're going to drop into the chat in one moment a link so you can register for that program. And I think, Tracy, you're going to tell us about one that you've got coming up over at the Pratt, right?
Yes, that program sounds great. And also, again, thank you, Alex, so much for this discussion. There's so much to talk about with Asimov and his legacy and the complicated pieces of that. So I do hope people join us for this upcoming Pratt Library program that I'm going to mention. It is Writers Live with Alexis Coe. Her book came out this year, You'll Never Forget Your First, a biography of George Washington. So she's also a public historian that looks at complicated legacies as well. And so that is January 13th at 7 p.m. on Zoom and Facebook Live. So we hope you'll join us for that. And also, before we start the community reading of Nightfall, I'd like to remind everyone that you can also find copies of Alex's books from the Ivy Bookshop. I can drop that link in the Zoom chat. I know Laura also shared the direct link to HarperCollins. And I am going to kick us off for the Nightfall reading with the epigraph from Emerson. And it goes, if the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God? So I am so thrilled to welcome our first reader, Alan.
Hello. Reading 1. Anton 77, director of Saro University, thrust out a belligerent lower lip and glared at the young newspaperman in a hot fury. Theremin 762 took that fury in his stride. In his earlier days, when his now widely syndicated column was only a mad idea in the cub reporter's mind, he had specialized in impossible interviews. It had cost him bruises, black eyes, and broken bones, but it had given him an ample supply of coolness and self-confidence. So he lowered the outthrust hand that had been so pointedly ignored and calmly waited for the aged director to get over the words. Astronomers were queer ducks. If Anton's actions of the last 2 months meant anything, the same Anton was the queer, duckiest of the lot. Anton 77 found his voice, and though it trembled with restrained emotions, the careful, somewhat pedantic phraseology for which the famous astronomy was noted did not abandon him. Sir, he said, your display of infernal gall is coming to me with that impudent proposition of yours. The husky telephotographer of the observatory Binet 25 thrust a tongue tip across his dry lips and interposed nervously. Now, sir, after all, the director turned to him and lifted an eyebrow. Do not interfere, Binet. I will credit you with good intentions in bringing this man here, but I will tolerate no insubordination now. Theremin decided it was time to take a part. Director Anton, if you'll let me finish what I started saying, I don't believe, young man, retorted Anton, that anything you would say now would count much as compared with your daily columns of the last 2 months. You have led a vast newspaper campaign against the efforts of myself and my colleagues to organize the world against the menace which it is now too late to avert. You have done your best with your highly personal attacks to make the staff of the observatory objects of ridicule. The director lifted a copy of the Cerro City Chronicle from the table and shook it furiously. Even a person of your well-known impudence should have hesitated before coming to me with the press that he'd be allowed to cover today's events for a paper. Of all newsmen, you! Anton dashed the newspaper to the floor, strode to the window, and clasped his arms behind his back. You may leave, he snapped over his shoulder. He stared moodily out at the skyline, where Gamma, the brightest of the planet's 6 suns, was setting. It had already faded and yellowed into the horizon mist, and Anton knew he would never see it again as a sane man. He whirled. No, wait! Come here! He gestured preemptively. I'll give you your story. The newsman had made no motion to leave, and now he approached the old man slowly. Anton gestured outward. Of the 6 suns, only Beta is left in the sky. Do you see it? The question was rather unnecessary. Beta was almost at zenith, its ruddy lights flooding the landscape to the unusual orange as brilliant rays of setting Gamma died. Beta was at Philion. It was small, smaller than Theremin had ever seen it before, and for the moment it was undisputed ruler of the Lagish sky. Lagus's own son Alpha, the one about which it revolved, was at the Antipodes, as were the 2 distant companion pairs. The red dwarf Beta, Alpha's immediate companion, was alone, grimly alone.
Anton's upturned face flushed readily in the sunlight. In just under 4 hours, he said, civilization as we know it comes to an end. It will do so because, as you see, Beta is the only sun in the sky. He smiled grimly. Print that. There'll be no one to read it. But if it turns out that 4 hours pass, and another 4, and nothing happens, asked Theramon softly. Don't let that worry you. Enough will happen. Granted. And still, if nothing happens, for a second time, Binet 25 spoke. Sir, I think you ought to listen to him. Theramon said, put it to a vote, Director Anton. There was a stir among the remaining 5 members of the observatory staff, who till now had maintained an attitude of weary neutrality. That, stated Anton flatly, is not necessary. He drew out a pocket watch. Since your good friend Binet insists so urgently, I will give you 5 minutes. Talk away. Good. Now, just what difference would it make if you allowed me to take down an eyewitness account of what's to come? If your prediction comes true, my presence won't hurt, for in that case, my column would never be written. On the other hand, if nothing comes of it, you will just have to expect ridicule, or worse. It would be wise to leave that ridicule to friendly hands. Anton snorted. What do you mean yours when you speak of friendly hands? Certainly. Thurman sat down and crossed his legs. My columns maybe have been a little rough, but I gave you people the benefit of the doubt every time. After all, this is not the century to preach the end of the world is at hand to Lagos. You have to understand that people don't believe the book of Revelations anymore, and it annoys them to have scientists turn about face and tell us the cultists are right after all. No such thing, young man, interrupted Anton. While a great deal of our data has been supplied us by the cult, our results contain none of the cult's mysticism. Facts are facts, and the cult's so called mythology has certain facts behind it. We've exposed them and ripped away their mystery. I assure you that the cult hates us now worse than you do. I don't hate you. I'm just trying to tell you that the public is in an ugly humor. They're angry. Anton twisted his mouth in derision. Let them be angry. Yes, but what about tomorrow? There'll be no tomorrow. But if there is, say that there is, just to see what happens. That anger might take shape in something serious. After all, business has taken a nosedive these last 2 months. Investors don't really believe the world is coming to an end, but just the same, they're being cagey with their money until it's all over. Johnny Public doesn't believe you either, but the new spring furniture might just as well wait a few months, just to make sure. You see the point. Just as soon as this all over, the business interests will be after your hide. They'll say that if crackpots, begging your pardon, can upset the country's prosperity anytime they want, simply by making some crock-eyed prediction, it's up to the planet to prevent them. The sparks will fly, sir. The director regarded the column sternly. And just what were you proposing to do to help the situation? Well, Theremin grinned. I was proposing to take charge of the publicity. I can handle things so that only the ridiculous side will show. It would be hard to stand, I admit, because I'd have to make you all out to be a bunch of gibbering idiots. But if I can get people laughing at you, they might forget to be angry. In return for that, all my publisher asks is an exclusive story. The nanny nodded and burst out. Sir, the rest of us think that he's right. These last 2 months we've considered everything but the 1,000,000 to 1 chance that there is an error somewhere in our theory or in our calculations. We ought to take care of that too.
There was a murmur of agreement from the men grouped about the table, and Anton's expression became that of one who found his mouth full of something bitter and couldn't get rid of it. You may stay if you wish, then. You will kindly refrain, however, from hampering us in our duties in any way. You will also remember that I am in charge of all activities here, and in spite of your opinions as expressed in your columns, I will expect full cooperation and full respect. His hands were behind his back, and his wrinkled face thrust forward determinedly as he spoke. He might have continued indefinitely, but for the intrusion of a new voice. Hello, 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 it came in a high tenor. And the plump cheeks of the newcomer expanded with a pleased smile. What's this morgue-like atmosphere here? No one's losing his nerve, I hope. Anton stared in consternation and said peevishly, Now what the devil are you doing here, Sheeran? I thought you were going to stay behind in the hideout. Sheeran laughed and dropped his stubbly figure into the chair. Hideout be blowed. The place bored me. I wanted to be here, where things are getting hot. Don't you suppose I have my share of curiosity? I want to see these stars the cultists are forever speaking about. He rubbed his hands and added in a soberer tone, It's freezing outside. The wind's enough to hang icicles on your nose. Beta doesn't seem to give any heat at all, at the distance it is. The white-haired director ground his teeth in sudden exasperation. Why do you go out of your way to do crazy things, Sheeran? What good are you around here? What good am I around there? Sheeran spread his palms in comical resignation. A psychologist isn't worth his salt in the hideout. They need men of action and strong, healthy women that can breed children.
Me, I'm 100 pounds too heavy for a man of action, and I want to be a success at breeding children. So why bother them with an extra mouth to feed? I feel better over here. Theremin spoke briskly. Just what is the hideout, sir? Shiram seemed to consider the columnist for the first time. He frowned and blew his ample cheeks out. And just who in language are you, redhead? Anton compressed his lips and then muttered sullenly. That's Theremin 762, the newspaper fellow. I suppose you've heard of him. The columnist offered his hand. And of course, you're Shiran 501 of Saro University. I've heard of you. Then he repeated, what is his hideout, sir? Well, said Shiran, we have managed to convince a few people of the validity of our prophecy and of doom to be spectacular about it. And those few have taken proper measures. They consist mainly of the immediate members of the families of the observatory staff, certain faculty of Saro University, and a few outsiders. Although they number about 300, but 3/4 are women and children. I see, they're supposed to hide where the darkness and the stars can't get at them, and then hold out when the rest of the world goes poof. If they can, it won't be easy, with mankind insane, with the great cities going up in flames. Environment will not be conducive to survival, but they have food, water, shelter, and weapons. They've got more, said Anton. They've got all our records except for what we will collect today. Those records will mean everything to the next cycle, and that's what must survive. The rest can go hang.
Theremin uttered a long, low whistle and sat brooding for several minutes. The men about the table had brought out a multi-chess board and started a 6-member game. Moves were made rapidly and in silence. All eyes bent in furious concentration on the board. Theremin watched them intently and then rose and approached Aton, who sat apart in whispered conversation with Shiran. Listen, he said. Let's go somewhere where we won't bother the rest of the fellows. I want to ask some questions. The aged astronomer frowned sourly at him, but Shiran chirped up. Certainly, it will do me good to talk. It always does. Aton was telling me about your ideas concerning world reaction to a failure of the prediction. And I agree with you. I read your column pretty regularly, by the way, and as a general thing, I like your views. Please, Shiran, growled Aton. Oh, all right. We'll go into the next room. It has softer chairs anyway. There were softer chairs in the next room. There were also thick red curtains on the windows and a maroon carpet on the floor. With the bricky light of Beta pouring in, the general effect was one of dried blood. Theremin shuddered. Say, I'd give 10 credits for a decent dose of white light for just a second. I wish Gamma or Delta were in the sky. What are your questions? Asked Aton. Please remember that our time is limited. In a little over an hour and a quarter, we're going upstairs, and after that, there will be no time for talk. Well, here it is. Theremin leaned back and folded his hands on his chest. You people seem so all-fired serious about this that I'm beginning to believe you. Would you mind explaining what it's all about? Aton exploded. Do you mean to sit there and tell me that you've been bombarding us with ridicule without even finding out what we've been trying to say? The columnist grinned sheepishly. It's not that bad, sir. I've got the general idea. You say there is going to be a worldwide darkness in a few hours and that all mankind will go violently insane. What I want now is the science behind it. No, you don't. No, you don't, broke in Shiran. If you ask Aton for that, supposing him to be in the mood to answer at all, he'll trot out pages of figures and volumes of graphs. You won't be able to make head or tail of it. Now, if you were to ask me, I could give you the layman's standpoint. All right, I ask you. Then first I'd like a drink. He rubbed his hands and looked at Aton. Water, grunted Aton. Don't be silly. Don't you be silly. No alcohol today. It would be too easy to get my men drunk. I can't afford to tempt them. The psychologist grumbled wordlessly. He turned to Theramon, impaled him with his sharp eyes, and began. You realize, of course, that the history of civilization on Lagash displays a cyclic character. But I mean cyclic. I know, replied Theramon cautiously, that is the current archaeological theory. Has it been accepted as fact? Just about. In this last century, it's been generally agreed upon. This cyclic character is, or rather was, one of the great mysteries. We've located series of civilizations, 9 of them definitely, and indications of others as well, all of which have reached heights comparable to our own, and all of which, without exception, were destroyed by fire at the very height of their culture. And no one could tell why. All centers of culture were thoroughly gutted by fire, with nothing left behind to give a hint as to the cause. Theramon was following closely. Wasn't there a Stone Age too? Probably. But as yet, practically nothing is known about it, except that men of that age were little more than rather intelligent apes. We can forget about that. I see. Go on.
There have been explanations of these recurrent catastrophes, all of a more or less fantastic nature. Some say that there are periodic rains of fire, some that Lagash passes through a sun every so often, some even wilder things. But there is one theory quite different from all of these that has been handed down over a period of centuries. I know, you mean this myth of the stars that the cultists have in their Book of Revelations. Exactly, rejoined Shirin with satisfaction. The cultists said that every 2,050 years, Lagash entered into a huge cave, so that all the suns disappeared, and there came total darkness all over the world. And then, they say, things called stars appeared, which robbed men of their souls and left them unreasoning brutes, so that they destroyed the civilization they themselves had built up. Of course, they mix all this up with a lot of religion mystic notions, but that's the central idea. There was a pause in which Shirin drew a long breath. And now we come to the theory of universal gravitation. He pronounced the phrase that the capital letters sounded, and at that point, Aton turned from the window, snorted loudly, and stalked out of the room. The two stared after him, and Theramon said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing in particular," replied Shirin. "2 of the men were due several hours ago and haven't shown up yet. He's terrifically shorthanded, of course, because all but the really essential men have gone to the hideout." "You don't think the 2 deserted, do you?" "Who? Pharaoh and Yemot? Of course not. Still, if they're not back within the hour, things would get a little sticky." He got to his feet suddenly, and then his eyes twinkled. "Anyway, as long as Aton is gone." Tiptoeing to the nearest window, he squatted, and from the low window box beneath withdrew a bottle of red liquid that gurgled suggestively when he shook it. "I thought Aton didn't know about this," he remarked as he trotted back to the table. "Here, we've only got 1 glass, so, as the guest, you can have it. I'll keep the bottle." And he filled the tiny cup with judicious care. Theramon rose to protest, but Shirin eyed him sternly. "Respect your elders, young man." The newsman seated himself with a look of anguish on his face. "Go ahead then, you old villain." The psychologist's Adam's apple wobbled as the bottle upended, and then, with a satisfied grunt and a smack of the lips, he began again. "But what do you know about gravitation?" "Nothing, except that it is a very recent development, not too well established, and that the math is so hard that only 12 men in Lagash are supposed to understand it." "Nonsense, baloney. I can give you all the essential math in a sentence. The law of universal gravitation states that there exists a cohesive force among all bodies of the universe, such that the amount of this force between any 2 given bodies is proportional to the product of their masses divided by the square of the distances between them." "Is that all?" "That's enough. It took 400 years to develop it." "Why that long? It sounded simple enough the way you said it." "Because great laws are not divined by flashes of inspiration, whatever you may think. It usually takes the combined work of a world full of scientists over a period of centuries. After Genovi 4I discovered that Lagash rotated about the sun alpha rather than vice versa, and that was about 400 years ago, astronomers have been working. The complex motions of the six suns were recorded, analyzed, and unwoven. Theory after theory was advanced and checked and counterchecked and modified and abandoned and revived and converted to something else. It was a double of a job. Theremin nodded thoughtfully and held out his glass for more liquor. Sharon grudgingly allowed a few ruby drops to leave the bottle. It was 20 years ago, he continued, after remoistening his own throat, that it was finally demonstrated that the law of universal gravitation accounted exactly for the orbital motions of the six suns. It was a great triumph. Sharon stood up and walked to the window, still clutching his bottle. And now we're getting to the point. In the last decade, the motions of Lagash about alpha were computed according to gravity, and it did not account for the orbit observed, not even when all perturbations due to the other suns were included. Either the law was invalid, or there was another, as yet unknown, factor involved. Theramon joined Sharon at the window and gazed out past the wooded slopes where the spires of Sorrow City gleamed bloodily on the horizon. The newsman felt the tension of uncertainty grow within him as he cast a short glance at Beta. It glowered redly at Zenith, dwarfed and evil. "Go ahead, sir," he said softly. Sharon replied, "Astronomers stumbled about for years, each proposed theory more untenable than the one before, until Aton had the inspiration of calling the cult. The head of the cult, Sor 5, had access to certain data that simplified the problem considerably. Aton set to work on a new track. What if there were another non-luminous planetary body such as Lagash? What if there were, it would shine only by reflected light? And if it were composed of bluish rock, as Lagash itself largely is, then in the redness of the sky, the eternal blaze of the suns would make it invisible, drown it out completely." Theramon whistled. "What a screwy idea." "You think that's screwy? Listen to this. Suppose this body rotated about Lagash at such a distance and in such an orbit and had such a mass that its attention would exactly account for the deviations of Lagash's orbit from theory. Do you know what would happen?" The colonist shook his head. "Well, sometimes this body would get in the way of a sun, and Sharon emptied what remained in the bottle of a draft. "And it does, I suppose," Theramon said flatly. "Yes, but only one sun lies in its plane of revolution." He jerked the thumb at the shrunken sun above. "Beta. And it has been shown that the eclipse will occur only when the arrangement of the suns is such that Beta is alone in its hemisphere and at a maximum distance, at which time the moon is invariably at minimum distance. The eclipse that results, with the moon 7 times the apparent diameter of Beta, covers all of Lagash and lasts well over half a day, so that no spot on the planet escapes the effects. That eclipse comes once every 2,049 years. Theramon's face was drawn into an expressionless mask. "And that's my story?" The psychologist nodded. "That's all of it. First, the eclipse, which will start in 3/4 of an hour, and then universal darkness, and maybe these mysterious stars, then madness and end of the cycle." He brooded. "We had 2 months leeway, we at the observatory, and that wasn't enough time to persuade Lagash of the danger. 2 centuries might not have been enough, but our records are at the hideout, and today we photograph the eclipse. The next cycle will start off with the truth, and when the next eclipse comes, mankind will at last be ready for it. Come to think of it, that's part of your story too." A thin wind ruffled the curtains at the window as Theramon opened it and leaned out. It played coldly with his hair as he stared at the crimson sunlight on his hand. Then he turned in sudden rebellion. "What is there in darkness to drive me mad?"
Sharon smiled to himself as he spun the empty liquor bottle with abstracted motions of his hand. "Have you ever experienced darkness, young man?" The newsman leaned against the wall and considered. "No, can't say that I have. But I know what it is. He made vague motions with his fingers and then brightened. Just no light, like in caves. Have you ever been in a cave?" "In a cave? Of course not. I thought not. I tried last week. Just to see. but I got out in a hurry. I went in until the mouth of the cave was just visible as a blur of light, with black everywhere else. I never thought a person my weight could run that fast. Theramon's lip curled. Well, if it comes to that, I guess I wouldn't have to run if I'd been there. The psychologist studied the young man with an annoyed frown. My, don't you talk big. I dare you to draw the curtain. Thurman looked his surprise and said, "What for? If we had 4 or 5 suns out there, we might want to cut the light down for a bit of comfort. But now we don't have enough light as it is. That's the point. Just draw the curtain, then come here and sit down." "All right." Theramon reached for the tasseled string and jerked. The red curtain slid across the wide window, the brass wings hissing their way along the crossbar, and a dark red shadow clamped down on the room. Theramon's footsteps sounded hollowly in the silence as he made his way to the table, and then they stopped halfway. "I can't see you, sir," he whispered. "Feel your way," ordered Sharon in a strained voice. "But I can't see you, sir." The newsman was breathing harshly. "I can't see anything." "What did you expect?" came the grim reply. "Come here and sit down." The footsteps sounded again, wavering, approaching slowly. There was the sound of someone fumbling with a chair. Theramon's voice came thinly. "Here I am. I feel all right. You like it, do you?" No, it's pretty awful. The walls seem to be..." He paused. "They seem to be closing in on me. I keep wanting to push them away, but I'm not going mad. In fact, the feeling isn't as bad as it was." "All right, draw the curtain back again." There were cautious footsteps through the dark, the rustle of Theramon's body against the curtain as he felt for the tassel, and then the triumphant whoosh of the curtain slithering back. Red light flooded the room, and with a cry of joy, Theramon looked up at the sun. Sharon wiped the moistness off of his forehead with the back of a hand and said shakily, "And that was just a dark room." "It can be stood," said Theramon lightly. "Yes, a dark room can. But were you at the Juggernaut Conventional Exposition 2 years ago?" "No, it so happens I never got around to it. 6,000 miles was just a bit too much to travel, even for the exposition." "Well, I was there. You remember hearing about the Tunnel of Mystery that broke all records in the amusement arena? For the first month or so, anyway?" "Yes. Wasn't there some fuss about it?" "Very little. It was hushed up. You see, the Tunnel of Mystery was just a mile-long tunnel with no lights. You got into a little open car and joggled along through darkness for 15 minutes. It was very popular while it lasted." "Popular?" "Certainly. There's a fascination in being frightened when it's part of a game. A baby is born with 3 instinctive fears: of loud noises, of falling, and of the absence of light. That's why it's considered so funny to jump at someone and shout boo. That's why it's such fun to ride a roller coaster. And that's why the Tunnel of Mystery started cleaning up. People came out of the darkness shaking, breathless, half dead with fear, but they kept on paying to get in." "Wait a while. I remember now. Some people came out dead, didn't they? There were rumors of that after it shut down."
The psychologist snorted. "Bah, 2 or 3 died. That was nothing. They paid off the families of the dead ones and argued the Jongleur City Council into forgetting it. After all, they said, if people with weak hearts want to go through the tunnel, it was at their own risk. And besides, it wouldn't happen again. So they put a doctor in the front office and had every customer go through a physical examination before getting into the car. That actually boosted ticket sales. Well then, but you see, there's something else. People sometimes came out in perfect order, except they refused to go into buildings, any buildings, including palaces, mansions, apartment houses, tenements, cottages, huts, shacks, lean-tos, and tents." Theramon looked shocked. "You mean they refused to come in out of the open? Where did they sleep?" "In the open." They should have forced them inside. Oh, they did. Whereupon these people went into violent hysterics and did their best to bat their brains out against the nearest wall. Once you got them inside, you couldn't keep them there without a straitjacket or a heavy dose of tranquilizer. They must have been crazy, which is exactly what they were. 1 person out of every 10 who went into that tunnel came out that way. They called in the psychologist and we did the only thing possible. We closed down the exhibit. He spread his hands. What was the matter with these people? Asked Theremin finally. Essentially the same thing that was the matter with you when you thought the walls of the room were crushing in on you in the dark. There's a psychological term for mankind's instinctive fear of the absence of light. We call it claustrophobia because the lack of light is always tied up with enclosed places, so that fear of one is fear of the other, you see? And those people of the tunnel consisted of those unfortunates whose mentality did not quite possess the resiliency to overcome the claustrophobia that overtook them in the darkness. 15 minutes without light is a long time, and you only had 2 or 3 minutes, and I believe you were fairly upset. The people of the tunnel had what is called a claustrophobic fixation. Their latent fear of darkness and enclosed places had crystallized and become active, and as far as we can tell, permanent. That's what 15 minutes in the dark will do. There was a long silence, and Theremin's forehead wrinkled slowly into a frown. I don't believe it's that bad. You mean you don't want to believe, snapped Sheeran. You're afraid to believe. Look out the window. Theremin did so, and the psychologist continued without pausing. Imagine darkness everywhere, no light as far as you can see. The houses, the trees, the fields, the earth, the sky, black, and stars thrown in, for all I know, whatever they are. Can you conceive it? Yes, I can, declared Theremin, and Sheeran slammed his fist down upon the table in sudden passion. You lie. You can't conceive that. Your brain wasn't built for the conception, any more than it was built for the conception of infinity or of eternity. You can only talk about it. A fraction of the reality upsets you. And when the real thing comes, your brain is going to be presented with a phenomenon outside its limits of comprehension. You will go mad completely and permanently. There's no question of it. He added sadly, and another couple of millennia of painful struggle comes to nothing. Tomorrow, there won't be a city standing unharmed in all Lagash.
Theremin recovered part of his mental equilibrium. That doesn't follow. I still don't see where I can go loony just because there isn't a sun in the sky. But even if I did and everyone else did, how does that harm the cities? Are we going to blow them down? But Sheeran was angry too. If you were in darkness, what would you want more than anything else? What would it be that every instinct would call for? Light, damn you, light. Well, and how would you get light? I don't know, said Theremin flatly. What's the only way to get light short of a sun? How should I know? They were standing face to face and nose to nose. Sheridan said, You burn something, mister. Ever see a forest fire? Ever go camping and cook a stew over a wood fire? Heat isn't the only thing burning wood gives off, you know. It gives off light, and people know that. And when it's dark, they want light, and they're going to get it. So they burn wood? So they burn whatever they can get. They've got to have light. They've got to burn something, and wood isn't handy, so they'll burn whatever is nearest. They'll have their light, and every center of habitation goes up in flames. Eyes held each other through the whole matter, as though the whole matter were a personal affair with respective willpowers. And then Theremin broke away wordlessly. His breathing was harsh and ragged, and he scarcely noted the sudden hubbub that came from the adjoining room behind the closed door. Sheeran spoke, and it was with an effort that made it sound matter-of-fact. I think I hear Yimit's voice. He and Farrell are probably back. Let's go in and see what kept them. Might as well, muttered Theremin. He drew a long breath and seemed to shake himself. The tension was broken. The room was in an uproar, with members of the staff clustering around 2 young men who were removing outer garments even as they parried the miscellaneous of questions being thrown at them. Aton hustled through the crowd and faced the newcomers angrily. Do you realize that it's less than half an hour before deadline? Where have you two been? Pharaoh 24 seated himself and rubbed his hands. His cheeks were red with an outdoor chill. Yimit and I just finished carrying through a little crazy experiment of our own. We've been trying to see if we couldn't construct an arrangement by which we could simulate the appearance of darkness and stars so as to get an advanced notion of how it looked. There was a confused murmur from the listeners, and a sudden look of interest entered Aton's eyes. There wasn't anything said of this before. How did you go about it? Well, said Pharaoh, the idea came to Yimit and myself long ago, and we've been working it out in our spare time. Yimit knew of a low one-story house down by the city with a domed roof. It had once been a museum, I think. Anyways, we bought it. Where did you get that money? Interrupted Aton preemptively. Our bank accounts, grunted Yimit 70. It cost 2,000 credits. Then, defensively, well, what of it? Tomorrow, 2,000 credits will be 2,000 pieces of paper. That's all. Sure, agreed Pharaoh. We bought the place and rigged it up with black velvet from top to bottom so as to get as perfect a darkness as possible. Then we punched tiny holes in the ceiling and through the roof and covered them with tiny metal caps, all of which could be shoved aside simultaneously with the close of a switch. At least we didn't do that part ourselves. We got a carpenter and an electrician and some others. Money didn't count. The point was that we could get the light to shine through these holes in the roof so that we could get a starlight effect.
Not a breath was drawn during the pause that followed. Anton said stiffly, "You had no right to make a private Farr seemed abashed. I know, sir, but frankly, Yimit and I thought the experiment was a little dangerous. If the effect really worked, we half expected to go mad. From what Sheeran says about all this, we thought that would be rather likely. We wanted to take the risk ourselves. Of course, if we found we could retain sanity, it occurred to us we might develop immunity to the real thing and then expose the rest of you the same way. But things didn't work out at all. Why? What happened?" It was Yimit who answered. "We shut ourselves in and allowed our eyes to get accustomed to the dark. It's an extremely creepy feeling because the total darkness makes you feel as if the walls and ceiling are crushing in on you. But we got over that and pulled the switch. The caps fell away and the roof glittered all over with little dots of light. Well, nothing. That was the wacky part of it. Nothing happened. It was just a roof with holes in it, and that's just what it looked like. We tried it over and over again. That's what kept us so late. But there just isn't any effect at all." There followed a shocked silence, and all eyes turned to Sheeran, who sat motionless, mouth open. Thurman was the first to speak. "You know what this does to this whole theory you've got built up, Sheeran, don't you?" He was grinning with relief. But Sheeran raised his hand. "Now wait a while. Just let me think this through." And then he snapped his fingers, and when he lifted his head, there was neither surprise nor uncertainty in his eyes. Of course, he never finished. From somewhere up above, there sounded a sharp clang, and Binet, starting to his feet, dashed up the stairs with a, "What the devil?" The rest followed after. Things happened quickly. Once up in the dome, Binet cast one horrified glance at the shattered photographic plates and at the man bending over them, and then hurled himself fiercely at the intruder, getting a death grip around his throat. There was a wild threshing, and as others of the staff joined in, the stranger was swallowed up and smothered under the weight of half a dozen angry men. Aton came up last, breathing heavily. "Let him up." There was a reluctant unscrambling, and the stranger, panting harshly, with his clothes torn and his forehead bruised, was hauled to his feet. He had a short yellow beard, curled elaborately in the style affected by the cultists. Binet shifted his hold to a collar grip and shook the man savagely. "All right, rat, what's the idea? These plates." "I wasn't after them," retorted the cultist coldly. "That was an accident." Binet followed his glowering stare and snarled, "I see, you were after the cameras themselves. The accident with the plates was a stroke of luck for you then. If you had touched Snapping Bertha or any of the others, you would have died by slow torture. As it is," he drew his fist back. Aton grabbed his sleeve. Stop that, let him go. The young technician wavered, and his arm dropped reluctantly. Aton pushed him aside and confronted the cultist. You're Latimer, aren't you? The cultist bowed stiffly and indicated the symbol upon his hip. I am Latimer 25, adjutant of the 3rd class to His Serenity, SOAR 5. And Aton's white eyebrows lifted. You were with His Serenity when you visited me last week, weren't you? Latimer bowed a second time. Now then, what do you want? Nothing that you would give me of your own free will. SOAR 5 sent you, I suppose. Or is this your own idea? I won't answer that question. Will there be any further visitors? I won't answer that either. Aton glanced at his timepiece and scowled. Now, man, what is it your master wants of me? I have fulfilled my end of the bargain.
Latimer smiled faintly, but said nothing. I asked him, continued Aton angrily, for data only the cult could supply, and it was given to me. For that, thank you. In return, I promised to prove the essential truth of the creed of the cult. There was no need to prove that, came the proud retort. It stands proven by the Book of Revelations. For the handful that constitute the cult, yes, don't pretend to mistake my meaning. I offered to present scientific backing for your beliefs, and I did. The cultist's eyes narrowed bitterly. Yes, you did, with a fox's subtlety. For your pretended explanation backed our beliefs and at the same time removed all necessity for them. You made of the darkness and of the stars a natural phenomenon and removed all its real significance. That was blasphemy. If so, the fault isn't mine. The facts exist. What can I do but state them? Your facts are a fraud and a delusion. Aton stamped angrily. How do you know? And the answer came with the certainty of absolute faith. I know. The director purpled and Binet whispered urgently. Aton waved him silent. And what does SOAR 5 want us to do? He still thinks, I suppose, that in trying to warn the world to take measures against the menace of madness, we are placing innumerable souls in jeopardy. We aren't succeeding, if that means anything to him. The attempt itself has done harm enough, and your vicious efforts to gain information by means of your devilish instruments must be stopped. We obey the will of the stars, and I only regret that my clumsiness prevented me from wrecking your infernal devices. It wouldn't have done you much good, returned Aton. All our data, except for the direct evidence we intend collecting right now, is already safely cached and well beyond possibility of harm. He smiled grimly, but that does not affect your present status as an attempted burglar and criminal. He turned to the men behind him. Someone call the police at Saro City. There was a cry of distaste from Sheeran. Damn it, Aton, what's wrong with you? There's no time for that. Here, he hustled his way forward. Let me handle this. Aton stared down his nose at the psychologist. This is not the time for your monkey shines, Sheeran. Will you please let me handle this my own way? Right now you are a complete outsider here, and don't forget it. Sheeran's mouth twisted eloquently. Now, why should we go to the impossible trouble of calling the police, with Beta's eclipse a matter of minutes from now, when this young man here is perfectly willing to pledge his honor, his word of honor, to remain and to cause no trouble whatsoever? The cultist answered promptly, I will do no such thing. You're free to do what you want, but it's only fair to warn you that just as soon as I get my chance, I'm going to finish what I came out here to do. If it's my word of honor you're relying on, you'd better call the police. Sheeran smiled in a friendly fashion. You're a determined cuss, aren't you? Well, I'll explain something. Do you see that young man at the window? He's a strong, husky fellow, quite handy with his fists, and he's an outsider besides. Once the eclipse starts, there will be nothing for him to do except keep an eye on you. Besides him, there will be myself, a little too stout for active fisticuffs, but still able to help. Well, what of it? Demanded Latimer frozenly. Listen and I'll tell you, was the reply. Just as soon as the eclipse starts, we're going to take you, Theramon and I, and deposit you in a little closet with one door, to which is attached one giant lock and no windows. You will remain there for the duration. And afterward, breathed Latimer fiercely, there will be no one to let me out. I know as well as you do that the coming of the stars means I know it far better than you. With all your minds gone, you are not likely to free me. Suffocation or slow starvation, is it? about what I might have expected from a group of scientists, but I don't give my word if it's a matter of principle, and I won't discuss it further.
Aton seemed perturbed. His faded eyes were troubled. Really, Sheeran, locking him. Please, Sheeran motioned him impatiently to silence. I don't think for a moment things will go that far. Vladimir has just tried a clever little bluff, but I'm not a psychologist just because I like the sound of the word. He grinned at the cultist. Come now, you don't really think I'm trying anything as crude as slow starvation. My dear Vladimir, if I lock you in the closet, you are not going to see the darkness, and you are not going to see the stars. It does not take much knowledge of the fundamental creed of the cult to realize that for you to be hidden from the stars when they appear means the loss of your immortal soul. Now, I believe you to be an honorable man. I'll accept your word of honor to make no further effort to disturb proceedings, if you'll offer it. A vein throbbed in Vladimir's temple, and he seemed to shrink within himself as he said thickly, "You have it." And then he added with swift fury, "But it is my consolation that you will all be damned for your deeds of today." He turned on his heel and stalked to the high three-legged stool by the door. Sheeran nodded to the columnist. Take a seat next to him, Thermon, just as a formality. Hey, Thermon. But the newspaper man didn't move. He had gone pale to the lips. Look at that. The finger he pointed toward the sky shook, and his voice was dry and cracked. There was one simultaneous gasp as every eye followed the pointing finger and for one breathless moment stared frozenly. Beta was chipped on one side. The tiny bit of encroaching blackness was perhaps the width of a fingernail, but to the staring watchers, it magnified itself into the crack of doom. Only for a moment they watched, and after that there was a shrieking confusion that was even shorter of duration and which gave way to an orderly scurry of activity, each man at his prescribed job. At the crucial moment, there was no time for emotion. The men were merely scientists who work to do. Even Aton had melted away. Sheeran said prosaically, "First contact must have been made 15 minutes ago. A little early, but pretty good considering the uncertainties involved in the calculation." He looked about him and then tiptoed to Thermon, who still remained staring out the window, and dragged him away gently. Aton is furious, he whispered, so stay away. He missed first contact on account of this fuss with Vladimir, and if you get in his way, he'll have you thrown out the window. Thermon nodded shortly and sat down. Sheeran stared in surprise at him. "The devil, man," he exclaimed. "You're shaking." "Eh?" Thermon licked dry lips and then tried to smile. "I don't feel very well, and that's a fact." The psychologist's eyes hardened. "You're not losing your nerve." "No," cried Thermon in a flash of indignation. "Give me a chance, will you? I haven't really believed this rigmarole, not way down beneath anyway, till just this minute. Give me a chance to get used to the idea. You've been preparing yourself for 2 months or more." "You're right at that," replied Sheeran thoughtfully. "Listen, have you got a family, parents, wife, children?" Thermon shook his head. "You mean the hideout, I suppose." "No, you don't have to worry about that. I have a sister, but she's 2,000 miles away. I don't even know her exact address." "Well then, what about yourself? You've got time to get there, and they're one short anyway since I left. After all, you're not needed here, and you'll make a darned fine addition." Thermon looked at the other warily. "You think I'm scared stiff, don't you? Well, get this, mister. I'm a newspaper man, and I've been assigned to cover a story. I intend covering it."
There was a faint smile on the psychologist's face. "I see, Professor. Professional honor, is that it? You might call it that, but man, I'd give my right arm for another bottle of that sakura juice, even half the size of the one you bogged. If ever a fellow needed a drink, I do. He broke off. Sharon was nudging him violently. Do you hear that? Listen. Thurman followed the motion of the other's chin and stared at the cultist, who, oblivious to all about him, faced the window, a look of wild elation on his face, groaning to himself the while in sing-song fashion. What's he saying? Whispered the columnist. He's quoting Book of Revelations, 5th chapter, replied Sharon. Then urgently, keep quiet and listen, I tell you. The cultist's voice had risen in a sudden increase of fervor. And it came to pass that in those days the sun, Beta, held lone vigil in the sky for even long periods as the revolutions passed, until such time as for a full half a revolution, it alone, shrunken and cold, shone down upon Lagash. And men did assemble in the public squares and in the highways, there to debate and to marvel at the sight, for the strange depression had seized them. Their minds were troubled and their speech confused, for the souls of men awaited the coming of the stars. And in the city of Trigon at high noon, Verdret too came forth and said unto the men of Trigon, Lo, ye sinners, though ye scorn the ways of the righteous, yet will the time of reckoning come. Even now the cave approaches to swallow Langish, yea, and all it contains. And even as he spoke, the lips of the cave of darkness passed the edge of Beta, so that all languish, it was hidden from sight. Loud with the cries of men as it vanished, and great the fear of souls that fell upon them. It came to pass that the darkness of the cave fell upon Lagash, and there was no light on all the surface of Lagash. Men were even as blinded, nor could one man see his neighbor, though he felt his breath upon his face. And in the blackness there appeared the stars, in countless numbers, and to the strains of music of such beauty that the very leaves of the trees cried out in wonder. And in that moment the souls of men departed from them, and their abandoned bodies became even as beasts, even as brutes of the wild, so that through the blackened streets of the cities of Lagash they prowled with wild cries. From the stars there then reached down the heavenly flame, and where it touched, the cities of Lagash flamed to utter destruction, so that of man and of the works of men naught remained. Even then there was a subtle change in Latimer's tone. His eyes had not shifted, but somehow he had become aware of the absorbed attention of the other two. Easily, without pausing for breath, the timbre of his voice shifted, and the syllables became more liquid. Thurman, caught by surprise, stared. The words seemed on the border of familiarity. There was an elusive shift in the accent, a tiny change in the vowel stress, nothing more. Yet Latimer had become thoroughly unintelligible. Shireen smiled slyly. He shifted to some old cyclic tongue, probably their traditional second cycle. That was the language in which the books of Revelations was originally written, you know. It doesn't matter. I've heard enough. Thurman shoved his chair back and brushed his hair back with hands that no longer shook. I feel much better now. You do? Sheridan seemed mildly surprised. I'll say I do. I had a bad case of jitters just a while back, listening to you and your gravitation and seeing that eclipse start almost finished me. But this, he jerked a contemptuous thumb at the yellow-bearded cultist. This is the sort of thing my nurse used to tell me. I've been laughing at that sort of thing all my life, and I'm not going to let it scare me now.
He drew a deep breath and said with a hectic gaiety, but if I expect to keep on the good side of myself, I'm going to turn my chair away from the window. Sharon said, "Yes, but you better talk lower." Aton just lifted his head out of the box. He got it stuck into and gave you a look that should have killed you. Theramon made a mouth. I forgot about the old fellow. With elaborate care, he turned the chair from the window, cast one distasteful look over his shoulder and said, "It has occurred to me that there may be considerable immunity against the star madness." The psychologist did not answer immediately. Beta was past its zenith now, and the square of bloody sunlight that outlined the window upon the floor had lifted into Sharon's lap. He stared at it, its dusky color, and thoughtfully, and then bent and squinted into the sun itself. The chip in its side had grown to a black encroachment that covered a third of Beta. He shuddered, and when he straightened once more, his florid cheeks did not contain quite as much color as they had previously. With a smile that was almost apologetic, he reversed his chair also. There are probably 2 million people in Saro City, and they are all trying to join the cult at once in the gigantic revival. Then, ironically, the cult is in for an hour of unexampled prosperity. I trust they'll make the most of it. Now, that is what you said? Just this. How did the cultists manage to keep the book of Revelations going from cycle to cycle? And how, on Lagash, did it get written in the first place? There must have been some sort of immunity, for if everyone had gone mad, who would be left to write the book? Sheeran stared at his questioner ruefully. Well now, young man, there isn't any eyewitness answer to that, but we've got a few damn good notions as to what happened. You see, there are 3 kinds of people who might remain relatively unaffected. First, the very few who don't see the stars at all. The seriously retarded, or those who drink themselves into a stupor at the beginning of the eclipse and remain so to the end. We leave them out because they aren't really witnesses. Then there are the children below 6, to whom the world as a whole is too new and strange for them to be too frightened at stars and darkness. They would be just another item in an already surprising world. You see that, don't you? The other nodded doubtfully. I suppose so. Lastly, there are those whose minds are too coarselessly ingrained to be entirely toppled. The very sensitive would be scarcely affected. Oh, such people as some of our older work-broken peasants. Well, the children would have fugitive memories, and that combined with the confused, incoherent babblings of the half-mad morons formed the basis for the book of Revelations. Naturally, the book was based in the first place on the testimony of those least qualified to serve as historians. That is, children and morons, and was probably edited and re-edited through the cycles. Do you suppose, broke in Theramon, that they carried the book through the cycles the way they were planning on handling on the secret of gravitation? Sherman shrugged. Perhaps, but their exact method is unimportant. They do it somehow. The point I was getting at was that the books can't help you, but be a massive distortion, even if it was based on fact. For instance, do you remember the experiment with the holes in the roof that Pharaoh and Yemot tried, the one that didn't work? Yes. You know why it didn't work? He stopped and rose in alarm, for Aton was approaching, his face a twisted mask of consternation. What's happened?
Aton drew him aside, and Sharon could feel the fingers on his elbow twitching. Not so loud. Aton's voice was low and tortured. I've just gotten word from the hideout on the private line. Sharon broke in anxiously. They're in trouble? Not they, Aton stressed, the pronoun significantly. They sealed themselves off just a while ago, and they're going to stay buried till day after tomorrow. They're safe, but the city... Sharon, it's a shambles. You have no idea. He was having difficulty in speaking. Well, snapped Sharon impatiently, what of it? It will get worse. What are you shaking about? Then suspiciously, how do you feel? Aton's eyes sparked angrily at the insinuation and then faded to anxiety once more. You don't understand. The cultists are active. They're rousing the people to storm the observatory, promising them immediate entrance into grace, promising them salvation, promising them anything. What are we to do, Sharon? Sharon's head bent, and he stared in long abstraction at his toes. He tapped his chin with one knuckle, then looked up and said crisply, "Do? What is there to do? Nothing at all. Do the men know of this? No, of course not. Good, keep it that way. How long till totality? Not quite an hour? There's nothing to do but gamble. It will take time to organize any really formidable mob, and it will take more time to get them out here. We're a good 5 miles from the city." He glared out the window down the slopes to where the farmed patches gave way to clumps of white houses in the suburbs, down to where the metropolis itself was a blur on the horizon, a mist in the waning blaze of Beta. He repeated without turning, "It will take time. Keep on working and pray that totality comes first." Beta was cut in half, the line of division pushing a slight concavity into the still bright portion of the sun. It was like a gigantic eyelid shutting slantwise over the light of a world. The faint clatter of the room in which he stood faded into oblivion, and he sensed only the thick silence of the fields outside. The very insects seemed frightened mute, and things were dim. He jumped to the voice in his ear. Theremin said, "Is something wrong?" No. Go back to the chair. We're in the way." They slipped back to their corner, but the psychologist did not speak for a time. He lifted a finger and loosened his collar. He twisted his neck back and forth, but found no relief. He looked up suddenly. "Are you having any difficulty breathing?" The newspaper man opened his eyes wide and drew 2 or 3 long breaths. "No, why?" "I looked out the window too long, I suppose. The dimness got me. Difficulty in breathing is one of the first symptoms of a claustrophobic attack." Theremin drew another long breath. "Well, hasn't got me yet. Say, here's another of the fellows." Binet had interposed his bulk between the light and the pair in the corner, and Sharon squinted up at him anxiously. "Hello, Binet." The astronomer shifted his weight to the other foot and smiled feebly. "You won't mind if I sit down a while and join in the talk? My cameras are set and there's nothing to do till totality." He paused and eyed the cultist who 15 minutes earlier had drawn a small skin-bound book from his sleeve and had been poring intently over it ever since. "That rat hasn't been making trouble, has he?"
Sheeran shook his head. His shoulders were thrown back and he frowned his concentration as he forced himself to breathe regularly. He said, "Have you any trouble breathing, Binet?" Binet sniffed the air in his turn. "It doesn't seem stuffy to me. A touch of claustrophobia," explained Sheeran apologetically. "Oh, it worked itself differently with me. I get the impression that my eyes are going back on me. Things seem to blur and, well, nothing is clear. And it's cold, too." "Oh, it's cold, all right. That's no illusion." Theremin grimaced. "My toes feel as if they've been shipping them cross-country in a refrigerating car." "What we need," put in Sheeran, "is to keep our minds busy with extraneous affairs. I was telling you a while ago, Theremin, why Pharaoh's experiments with the holes in the roof came to nothing." "You were just beginning," replied Theremin. He encircled a knee with both arms and nuzzled his chin against it. "Well, as I started to say, they were misled by taking the Book of Revelations literally. There probably wasn't any sense in attaching any physical significance to the stars. It might be, you know, that in the presence of total darkness, the mind finds it absolutely necessary to create light. The illusion of light might be all the stars there really are." "In other words," interposed Theremin, "you mean the stars are the results of the madness and not one of the causes? Then what good will Binet's photographs be? To prove that it is an illusion, maybe, or to prove the opposite, for all I know. Then again..." But Binet had drawn his chair closer, and there was an expression of sudden enthusiasm on his face. "Say, I'm glad you two got onto this subject." His eyes narrowed and he lifted one finger. "I've been thinking about these stars, and I've got a really cute notion. Of course, it's strictly ocean foam, and I'm not trying to advance it seriously. But I think it's interesting. Do you want to hear it?" He seemed half reluctant, but Sheeran leaned back and said, "Go ahead, I'm listening." Well then, supposing there were other suns in the universe, he broke off a little bashfully. I mean, there are that are so far away that they're too dim to see. It sounds as if I've been reading some of that fantastic fiction, I suppose. Not necessarily. Still, isn't that possibility eliminated by the fact that according to the law of gravitation, they would make themselves evident by their attractive forces? Not if they were far enough off, rejoined Binet, really far off. Maybe as far as 4 light years or even more. We'd never be able to detect perturbations then because they'd be too small. Say that there were a lot of suns that far off, a dozen or 2 maybe. Theremin whistled melodiously. What an idea for a good Sunday supplement article. 24 suns in a universe 8 light years across. Wow, that would shrink our world into insignificance. The readers would eat it up. Only an idea, said Binet with a grin. But you see the point. During an eclipse, these dozen suns would become visible. There'd be no real sunlight to drown them out. Since they're so far off, they'd appear small, like so many marbles. Of course, the cultists talk of millions of stars. That's probably an exaggeration. There just isn't any place in the universe you could put 1 million suns, unless they touch one another. Sheeran had listened with gradually increasing interest. You've hit something here, Binet. An exaggeration is just exactly what would happen. Our minds, as you probably know, can't grasp directly any number higher than 5. Above that, there is only the concept of many. A dozen would become 1 million, just like that. A damn good idea. And I've got another cute little notion, Binet said. Have you ever thought what a simple problem gravitation would be if only you had a sufficiently simple system? Supposing you had a universe in which there was a planet with only 1 sun. The planet would travel in a perfect eclipse, and the exact nature of the gravitational force would be so evident it could be accepted as an axiom. Astronomers on such a world would start off with gravity probably before they even invented the telescope. Naked eye observation would be enough. But would such a system be dynamically stable? Questioned Sheeran doubtfully. Sure, they'd call it the 1-and-1 case. It's been worked out mathematically, and it's the philosophical implications that interest me. It's nice to think about, admitted Sheeran, as a pretty abstraction, like a perfect gas or absolute zero. Of course, continued Binet, there's the catch that life would be impossible on such a planet. It wouldn't get enough heat and light, and if it rotated, there would be total darkness of each day, half of each day. You couldn't expect life, which is fundamentally dependent upon light, to develop under those conditions. Besides, Sheeran's chair went over backward as he sprang to his feet in a rude interruption. Aton's brought out the lights. Binet said, huh? Turned to stare and then grinned halfway around his head in open relief. There were 6 foot-long, inch-thick rods cradled in Aton's arms. He glanced over them at their assembled staff members. Get back to work, all of you. Sheeran, come here and help me. Sheeran trotted to the older man's side, and one by one in utter silence, the two adjusted the rods in makeshift metal holders suspended from the walls. With the air of one carrying through the most sacred item of a religious ritual, Sheeran scraped a large, clumsy match into spluttering life and passed it to Aton, who carried the flame to the upper end of one of the rods. It hesitated there a while, playing futilely about the tip, until suddenly, crackling flare cast Aton's lined face into yellow highlights. He withdrew the match, and a spontaneous cheer rattled the window. The rod was toppled by 6 inches of wavering flame. Methodically, the other rods were lighted until 6 independent fires turned the rear of the room yellow. The light was dim, dimmer even than the tenuous sunlight. The flames reeled crazily, giving birth to drunken, swaying shadows. The torches smoked devilishly and smelled like a bad day in the kitchen, but they emitted yellow light. There was something about yellow light after 4 hours of somber, dimming beta. Even Latimer had lifted his eyes from his book and stared in wonder. Sheeran warmed his hands at the nearest, regardless of the soot that gathered upon them in a fine gray powder, and muttered ecstatically to himself, "Beautiful, beautiful. I never realized before what a wonderful color yellow is." But Theremin regarded the torches suspiciously. He wrinkled his nose at the rancid odor and said, "What are those things?" "Wood," said Sheeran shortly. "Oh no, they're not. They aren't burning. The top inch is charred and the flame just keeps shooting out of nothing. That's the beauty of it. This is a really efficient artificial light mechanism. We've made a couple hundred of them, but most went to the hideout, of course. You see," he turned and wiped his blackened hands upon his handkerchief. "You take the pithy core of coarse water reeds, dry them thoroughly, and soak them in animal grease. Then you set fire to it, and the grease burns little by little. These torches will burn for almost half an hour without stopping. Ingenious, isn't it? It was developed by one of our young men at Saro University." After the momentary sensation, the dome had quieted. Latimer had carried his chair directly beneath a torch and continued reading, lips moving in the monotonous recital of invocations to the stars. Binet had drifted away to his cameras once more, and Theremin seized the opportunity to add his notes on the article he was going to write for the Saro City Chronicle the next day, a procedure he had been following for the last 2 hours in a perfectly methodical, perfectly conscientious, and, as he was well aware, perfectly meaningless fashion. But, as the gleam of amusement in Sheeran's eyes indicated, careful note-taking occupied his mind with something other than the fact that the sky was gradually turning a horrible, deep purple red, as if it were one gigantic, freshly peeled beet, and so it fulfilled its purpose.
The air grew, somehow, denser. Dusk, like a palpable entity, entered the room, and the dancing circle of yellow light about the torches etched itself into ever sharper distinction against the gathering grayness beyond. There was the odor of smoke and the presence of little chuckling sounds that the torches made as they burned, the soft pad of one of the men circling the table at which he worked on hesitant tiptoes, the occasional indrawn breath of someone trying to retain composure in a world that was retreating into the shadow. It was Theremin who first heard the extraneous noise. It was a vague, unorganized impression of sound that would have gone unnoticed but for the dead silence that prevailed within the dome. The newsman sat upright and replaced his notebook. He held his breath and listened, then, with considerable reluctance, threaded his way between the solar scope and one of Binet's cameras and stood before the window. The silence ripped to fragments as his startled shout, "Sheeran!" Work stopped. The psychologist was at his side in a moment. Eitan joined him. Even Yimit 70, high on his little lean-back seat at the eyepiece of the gigantic solar scope, paused and looked downward. Outside, Beta was a mere smoldering splinter, taking one last desperate look at Lagash. The eastern horizon, in the direction of the city, was lost in darkness, and the road from Saro to the observatory was a dull red line, bordered on both sides by wooded tracks, the trees of which had somehow lost individuality and merged into a continuous shadowy mass. But it was the highway itself that held attention, for along it there surged another, an infinitely menacing shadowy mass. Eitan cried in a cracked voice, "The madmen from the city, they've come." "How long to totality?" demanded Sheeran. 15 minutes, but they'll be here in 5. Never mind, keep the men working. We'll hold them off. This place is built like a fortress. Eitan, keep an eye on our young cultists just for luck. Theremin, come with me. Sheeran was out the door, and Thermon was at his heels. The stairs stretched below them in tight circular sweeps about the central shaft, fading into a dank and dreary grayness. The first momentum of their rush had carried them 50 feet down, so that the dim flickering yellow from the open door of the dome had disappeared, and both above and below the same dusky shadow crushed in upon them. Sharon paused, and his pudgy hand clutched at his chest. His eyes bulged, and his voice was a dry cough. I can't breathe. Go down yourself. Close all doors. Thermon took a few downward steps, then turned. Wait, can you hold out a minute? He was panting himself. The air passed in and out his lungs like so much molasses, and there was a little germ of screeching panic in his mind at the thought of making his way into the mysterious darkness below by himself. Thermon, after all, was afraid of the dark. Stay here, he said. I'll be back in a second. He dashed upward 2 steps at a time, heart pounding, not altogether from the exertion, tumbled into the dome and snatched a torch from its holder. It was foul-smelling, and the smoke smarted his eyes almost blind, but he clutched that torch as if he wanted to kiss it for joy, and its flame streamed backward as he hurled down the stairs again. Sharon opened his eyes, moaned as Thermon bent over him. Thermon shook him roughly. All right, get a hold on yourself. We've got light. He held the torch at tiptoe height and, propping the tottering psychologist by an elbow, made his way downward in the middle of the protecting circle of illumination.
The offices on the ground floor still possessed what light there was, and Thermon felt the horror about him relax. Here, he said brusquely, and passed the torch to Sharon. You can hear them outside. And they could, little scraps of hoarse, wordless shouts. But Sharon was right. The observatory was built like a fortress, erected in the last century when the Neo-Gavitians style of architecture was at its ugly height. It had been designed for stability and durability rather than for beauty. The windows were protected by the grillwork of inch-thick iron bars sunk deep into the concrete sills. The walls were solid masonry that an earthquake couldn't have touched, and the main door was a huge oaken slab reinforced with iron. Thermon shot the bolt and then slid shut, they slid shut with a dull clang. At the other end of the corridor, Sharon cursed weakly. He pointed to the lock on the back door, which had been neatly jimmied into uselessness. That must have been how Latimer got in, he said. Well, don't stand there, cried Thermon impatiently. Help drag up the furniture. And keep the torch out of my eyes. The smoke's killing me. He slammed the heavy table up against the door as he spoke, and in 2 minutes had built a barricade which made up for what is lacking in beauty and symmetry by the sheer inertia of its massiveness. Somewhere dimly far off, you could hear the battering of naked fists upon the door, and the screams and yells from outside had a sort of half-reality. That mob had set off from Cerro City with only 2 things in mind, and the attainment of cultist salvation by the destruction of the observatory, and a maddening fear that all but paralyzed them. There was no time to think of ground cars or of weapons or of leadership or even of organization. They made for the observatory on foot and assaulted it with bare hands. And now they were there, the last flash beta, the last ruby red drop of flame flickered feebly over a humanity that had left only stark universal fear. Thermon groaned. Let's get back to the dome. In the dome, only Ymit at the oscilloscope had kept his place. The rest were clustered about the cameras, and Binet was giving his instruments a hoarse, strained voice. Get it straight, all of you. I'm snapping beta just before totality and changing the plate. That will leave one of you to each camera. You all know about times of exposure. There was a breathless amount of agreement. Benet passed a hand over his eyes. Are the torches still burning? Never mind, I see them. He was leaning hard against the back of the chair. Now remember, don't try to look for good shots. Don't waste time trying to get 2 stars at a time in the scope field. 1 is enough. And if you feel yourself going, get away from the cameras. At the door, Sharon whispered to Thurman, take me to Anton. I don't see him. The newsman did not answer immediately. The vague forms of the astronomer waved and blurred, and the torches overhead had become only yellow splotches. It's dark, he whimpered. Sharon held out a hand. Anton stumbled forward. Anton, Thurman stepped after and seized his arm. Wait, I'll take you. Somehow he made his way across the room. He closed his eyes against the darkness and his mind against the chaos within it. No one heard them or paid attention to them. Sharon stumbled against the wall. Anton, the psychologist felt shaking his hands touch him, then withdrawing voice muttering, is that you, Sharon? Anton, he strove to breathe normally. Don't worry about the mob. The place will hold them off.
Latimer, the cultist, rose to his feet and his face twisted in desperation. His word was pledged, and to break it would mean placing his soul in mortal peril. Yet that word had been forced from him and had not been given freely. The stars would come soon. He could not stand by and allow, and yet his word was pledged. Binet's face was dimly flushed as it looked upward at Beta's last ray, and Latimer, seeing him bend over his camera, made his decision. His nails cut the flesh of his palms as he tensed himself. He staggered crazily as he started his rush. There was nothing before him but shadows. The very floor beneath his feet lacked substance. And then someone was upon him, and he went down with clutching fingers at his throat. He doubled his knee and drove it hard into his assailant. Let me up or I'll kill you. Thurman cried out sharply and muttered through a blinding haze of pain, you double-crossing rat. The newsman seemed conscious of everything at once. He heard Binet croak, I've got it, at your cameras, men. And then there was a strange awareness that the last thread of sunlight had thinned out and snapped. Simultaneously, he heard one last choking gasp from Binet and a queer little cry from Sharon, a hysterical giggle that cut off in a rasp, and a sudden silence, a strange, deadly silence from outside. And Latimer had gone limp in his loosening grasp. Theramon peered into the cultist's eyes and saw the blankness of them, staring upward, mirroring the feeble yellow of the torches. He saw the bubble of froth upon Latimer's lips and heard the low animal whimper in Latimer's throat. With the slow fascination of fear, he lifted himself up on one arm and turned his eyes towards the blood-curdling blackness of the window. Through it shone the stars, not Earth's feeble 3,600 stars visible to the eye. Lagash was in the center of a giant cluster. 30,000 mighty suns shone down in a soul-searing splendor that was more frighteningly cold in its awful indifference than the bitter wind that shivered across the cold, horribly bleak world. Theramon staggered to his feet, his throat constricting him to breathlessness, all the muscles of his body writhing in an intensity of terror and sheer fear beyond bearing. He was going mad and knew it, and somewhere, deep inside, a bit of sanity was screaming, struggling to fight off the hopeless flood of black terror. It was very horrible to go mad and know that you were going mad, to know that in a little minute you would be here physically, and yet all the real essence would be dead and drowned in the black madness. For this was the dark and the cold and the doom. The bright walls of the universe were shattered, and their awful black fragments were falling down to crush and squeeze and obliterate him. He jostled someone crawling on hands and knees, but stumbled somehow over him. Hands groping at his tortured throat, he limped towards the flame of the torches that filled all his mad vision. Light, he screamed. Aton, somewhere, was crying, whimpering horribly like a terribly frightened child. Stars, all the stars. We didn't know it all. We didn't know anything. We thought 6 stars in a universe is something. The stars didn't notice his darkness forever and ever and ever, and the walls are breaking in, and we didn't know, we couldn't know in anything. Someone clawed at the torch, and it fell and snuffed out. In the instant, The awful splendor of the indifferent stars leaped nearer to them. On the horizon outside the window, in the direction of Saro City, a crimson glow began growing, strengthening in brightness that was not the glow of a sun. The long night had come again.
Thank you so much to all of our community readers. Give them another virtual round of applause. And thank you again for all of you joining us today. We really appreciate you spending the afternoon talking about Asimov with us and listening to two of his stories. Thank you, of course, to Alec Navala Lee for providing the excellent context of Asimov with all of his work and research. Thank you to our captioner, Sherry Kochman, who has helped provide accessibility for this afternoon into evening for those of you on the East Coast. As you leave, just a reminder that you'll be directed to a survey upon exiting the webinar, and we really encourage you to provide feedback about the event that helps future events be planned. And we'll, of course, again, drop general links to the Jewish Museum of Maryland and the Enoch Pratt Free Library websites, so you can connect with both of our organizations. Even if you're local to Baltimore or if you're from further away, you can engage with us virtually during this time and just learn more about what we're doing. So thank you again for attending and supporting, and of course for supporting museums and libraries around the country. So I am double checking to make sure everything is in the chat. Everything is in the chat, so I think we're all set, and thank you everyone and have a wonderful night.